Love bombing. Love bombing is one of the most intoxicating and disorienting psychological tactics ever used to pull someone into emotional dependence. It begins with a flood of affection, attention, validation, and praise so overwhelming that the target feels chosen, special, and deeply seen. At its core, love bombing is not about love at all. It's about control. It is a calculated strategy designed to break down emotional defenses by giving the one thing almost every human craves, the feeling of being unconditionally wanted. In the beginning, love bombing feels like a dream. The person showers you with constant compliments, long messages, surprise gifts, and dramatic declarations of connection. They tell you that you're different from everyone else, that they've never felt this way before, that you are the missing piece they've been waiting for. They match your interests, your humor, your goals, your insecurities almost too perfectly. It feels like destiny, like synchronicity, like the universe has finally aligned in your favor. But what makes love bombing so powerful is not just the intensity, it's the emotional contrast it creates. The human brain responds intensely to rewards that feel sudden and overwhelming. The constant surge of affection releases dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin, creating a neurochemical attachment that feels addictive. The target starts associating the love bomber with emotional high points, making them more vulnerable to future manipulation. Once the bond is formed, the love bomber knows they have psychological leverage. What often goes unnoticed in the early stages is how the love bomber subtly gathers information while building this intense connection. They learn your fears, your past wounds, your unmet needs, and your desires. They pay attention to what makes you light up and what makes you break. They mirror your values to appear like your perfect match, and in doing so, they become the very person your mind wants to trust. This emotional engineering creates a sense of safety so convincing that the victim begins to let their guard down completely. Then, at the height of attachment, the shift comes. The affection slows, the messages become shorter, the certainty they once expressed begins to blur. The attention you were flooded with suddenly feels rationed. This intentional withdrawal hits like emotional whiplash, triggering anxiety, longing, and confusion. The brain, now conditioned to crave the intensity of the initial affection, goes into a desperate search for it again. This is where the love bomber gains full control. Their attention becomes the reward you chase. Their approval becomes the measure of your worth. Their affection becomes the thing you feel compelled to earn. Love bombing works because it manipulates the deepest human longing to feel chosen and irreplaceable. It turns vulnerability into dependence. It makes isolation feel like intimacy. And the victim often blames themselves for the sudden change, believing they must have done something to lose the love they were once drowning in. The truth is that the affection was never real. It was a hook. The person offering it was not trying to love you, they were trying to own you. Gradual desensitization. Gradual desensitization is one of the most quietly dangerous psychological tactics because it doesn't shock you. It slowly reshapes you. Instead of pushing boundaries all at once, the manipulator introduces small changes over time, each one subtle enough to ignore, easy enough to justify, and harmless enough that you convince yourself nothing is wrong. It works by numbing your natural instincts, softening your defenses, and conditioning you to accept what you once would have rejected outright. It often begins with something so minor you barely register it. A small comment that crosses a line, a request that feels slightly uncomfortable, a behavior that makes you pause but seems too trivial to address. You brush it off, telling yourself it's not worth making a scene. That moment is the manipulator's first victory, not because of the act itself, but because you stayed silent. Silence in psychological manipulation is not peace. It is permission. From there, each step becomes slightly bolder. They push a little farther, ask a little more, take a little more control. What would have alarmed you if done all at once now feels like a natural progression. The human brain adapts quickly, and manipulators exploit this by increasing their behavior so gradually that your emotional baseline shifts without you even realizing it. What once felt unacceptable begins to feel normal. What once felt intrusive becomes expected. What once would have made you leave now barely feels worth mentioning. This technique works because humans are wired to avoid confrontation and seek harmony. Most people want to give others the benefit of the doubt. Manipulators count on this. They rely on your desire to be reasonable, understanding, patient, forgiving. They test how far they can go, then expand that line inch by inch. Over time, the target becomes conditioned to tolerate disrespect, emotional control, isolation, or even abuse, believing they are simply adapting rather than being manipulated. One of the most chilling aspects of gradual desensitization is how it affects self-perception. As the manipulator escalates, you begin to question your reactions. Maybe you're overthinking, maybe you're being sensitive, maybe it's not a big deal. This internal doubt is exactly what the manipulator wants. The more you second-guess yourself, the less resistance you offer. By the time you start to sense something is wrong, your tolerance has already been stretched far beyond what your past self would ever have accepted. This tactic is used in toxic relationships, cult recruitment, grooming, coercive control, and even political propaganda. It is the art of changing someone without them realizing they are being changed, and it is effective because the process feels so gradual, so gentle, so quiet, that the victim often doesn't recognize the manipulation until they are deeply entangled emotionally, psychologically, or even financially. What makes gradual desensitization so emotionally devastating is that you wake up one day and realize you have drifted miles from who you used to be. You look back at the small compromises, the tiny concessions, the harmless exceptions you thought meant nothing, and suddenly you see the pattern. You see how each step was deliberate, how each boundary softened, how each moment of silence strengthened their control, and it hits you with a kind of grief that is both shocking and heartbreaking, the realization that you were slowly rewritten without ever noticing it happening. Emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail is one of the most psychologically suffocating manipulation tactics because it weaponizes your own feelings against you. It operates on a cruel equation. Your fear, guilt, or sense of responsibility becomes their leverage. Instead of communicating needs honestly, the manipulator pushes you into compliance by threatening your emotional security, subtly or overtly implying that if you don't do what they want, something terrible will happen to your relationship, your peace, or even your self-worth. It is a psychological trap designed to make you feel obligated, ashamed, or afraid to say no. Emotional blackmail often begins with subtle hints. They may phrase their desires as fragile needs, making you feel like denying them would cause them pain. They position themselves as vulnerable, misunderstood, or easily hurt. And because you care, or because they've convinced you that you should, you bend. You make exceptions. You sacrifice your comfort to protect their feelings. That first small concession becomes the opening they need. Once they learn that guilt moves you, they start pulling those strings more deliberately. The heart of emotional blackmail lies in creating a sense of conditional affection. You begin to realize that their love, approval, or calmness depends entirely on your compliance. If you disagree, they withhold warmth. If you set a boundary, they punish you with silence, anger, or accusations. If you assert yourself, they claim you are selfish or ungrateful. They twist the narrative so you feel like the villain for protecting your own needs. Each time you try to reclaim your autonomy, they make you feel responsible for their hurt, their sadness, their disappointment. This manipulation is powerful because it preys on your deepest human instincts to care, to help, to maintain harmony. Your empathy becomes the very tool used to control you. The manipulator learns exactly which emotional buttons produce which reactions. If guilt works, they use guilt. If fear works, they use fear. If obligation works, they use obligation. Nothing is accidental. They understand that if they can make you feel like denying them will make you a bad person, you will choose self-sacrifice over self-respect. Over time, emotional blackmail conditions you to anticipate their reactions. You start editing your own behavior to avoid conflict, walking on eggshells to keep them emotionally stable. You blame yourself for their moods, their anger, their distance. You internalize the idea that it's your job to keep the relationship functioning. The manipulator doesn't have to pressure you anymore. You pressure yourself. This self-blame is the final stage of emotional control, where the victim becomes their own enforcer. What makes emotional blackmail so psychologically devastating is the way it twists love into fear, trust into anxiety, and responsibility into self-erasure. You begin to lose your voice. Your boundaries weaken. Your confidence fractures. You become someone who bribes another person with your own well-being, hoping that if you just give more, sacrifice more, comply more, they will stop hurting you. But they never do, because the goal was never resolution. It was control. Emotional blackmail doesn't just trap you. It convinces you that the cage is your fault. Learned helplessness induction. Learned helplessness induction is one of the most psychologically crippling manipulation tactics because it doesn't just limit your choices. It convinces you that you have no choices at all. It works by gradually breaking down your belief in your own power, your own judgment, and your own ability to change your circumstances. Instead of controlling you through force, the manipulator controls you by shaping your reality until you stop resisting, stop hoping, and eventually stop trying. It is the slow erosion of a person's inner strength until they no longer fight back, not because they agree, but because they believe they can't win. This tactic often begins with a pattern of unpredictable punishments and rewards. Every time you try to assert yourself, set a boundary, express discomfort, or make an independent decision, the manipulator responds with criticism, withdrawal, anger, or emotional sabotage. They make you feel foolish for trying to stand up for yourself. They make your efforts seem pointless, but on rare occasions they may offer kindness or approval, creating a confusing cycle that keeps you off balance. The inconsistency is what breaks you. You never know what response you'll get, so eventually you learn not to act at all. Over time, this creates a psychological state where you begin to believe that nothing you do will make a difference. You stop pushing back because every attempt has been met with failure, ridicule, or consequences. You stop making decisions because you've been told you always choose wrong. You stop expressing your needs because they've been dismissed so many times that you start to believe they don't matter. The manipulator teaches you, slowly and meticulously, that your voice is powerless. And once you believe that, they no longer need to silence you. You silence yourself. This manipulation is devastating because it reshapes your identity. You begin to see yourself through the eyes of the one controlling you, incapable, needy, incompetent, burdensome. Even when opportunities to escape appear, you don't take them, not because you don't want freedom, but because you genuinely believe you couldn't survive without the manipulator, or that leaving would only lead to more pain. The cage is no longer physical or emotional, it becomes mental. You start to feel safer inside it than outside it. What makes learned helplessness induction so emotionally brutal is the way it twists your failures into proof of your worthlessness. Every setback becomes ammunition for the manipulator. Every mistake becomes a lecture. Every moment of exhaustion becomes confirmation that you're weak. But the truth is that the exhaustion was created, the weakness was engineered, the failures were orchestrated. Your hopelessness is not a reflection of who you are, but of what was done to you. One of the most heartbreaking effects of learned helplessness is how deeply it rewires the mind. Even when you're given support, encouragement, or a way out, part of you hesitates. Part of you fears trying. Part of you believes that any effort is doomed before it begins. This isn't a lack of desire or intelligence. It's the scar left by prolonged psychological conditioning. When someone teaches you over and over again that your efforts are meaningless, eventually you stop believing in your ability to change anything at all. Fear appeal. Fear appeal is one of the most primal and powerful psychological manipulation tactics because it reaches into the deepest corners of the human mind, where survival instincts drown out logic, where anxiety replaces clarity, and where fear becomes the silent puppeteer pulling your decisions. It works by triggering a sense of danger, loss, or threat so intense that you feel compelled to act, comply, or obey just to escape the discomfort. Manipulators know that fear overrides reason. When someone is afraid, they don't think, they react. Fear appeal usually begins with the creation of a looming threat. Sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implied. It could be the fear of abandonment, rejection, failure, humiliation, punishment, or loss. The manipulator paints a picture of what could happen if you don't listen, don't agree, or don't stay. They might warn you that others will turn against you, that you'll ruin everything, that no one else will want you, that you'll end up alone, that something terrible is waiting just outside the boundaries of their control. The fear doesn't have to be real. It just has to feel believable enough that your mind starts filling in the blanks. What makes fear appeal so gripping is the way it hijacks your nervous system. When fear is triggered, your brain activates the fight or flight response, flooding your body with stress hormones. Your heartbeat quickens, your thoughts race, and your sense of judgment blurs. In this heightened state, you become more suggestible, more obedient, and more desperate for relief. The manipulator becomes the one person who can either intensify the fear or alleviate it, and that dual role gives them enormous psychological power. Fear is also deeply personal. A skilled manipulator learns what scares you: instability, conflict, abandonment, failure, being misunderstood, being alone. They study your vulnerabilities like a map, memorizing every emotional weak point. Then, when they need influence, they press exactly where it hurts. They frame themselves as your protector while subtly becoming the source of the danger. It is a terrifying paradox. They frighten you, and then they offer the comfort you crave. The emotional exhaustion from constant fear conditioning begins to erode your confidence. You start to second-guess your decisions, your perceptions, and your ability to cope without their guidance. You might find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, complying with things that make you uncomfortable, agreeing to things you once would have refused. The fear doesn't just shape your actions, it reshapes your identity. You begin to see yourself as fragile, incapable, dependent, or unsafe without their presence. Fear appeal is used in toxic relationships, authoritarian environments, marketing, politics, and even childhood conditioning. It works because fear is a universal human experience, raw, immediate, and overwhelming. But the darkest part of this tactic is the moment you realize that the fear controlling you wasn't natural. It was planted. The threat wasn't real. It was constructed. And the person you were clinging to for protection was the one quietly tightening the noose of anxiety around your mind. Authority bias exploitation. Authority bias exploitation is one of the most insidious psychological tactics because it manipulates a deep instinct wired into the human mind, the tendency to trust, obey, and defer to those who appear powerful, knowledgeable, or superior. Instead of earning influence through honesty or integrity, the manipulator manufactures an illusion of authority and uses it to override your doubts, your instincts, and even your own judgment. It is the act of turning perceived power into unquestioned control. This tactic often begins with the manipulator positioning themselves as the expert. They speak with confidence. They present themselves as someone who knows better, and they repeat their opinions with a certainty that forces you to second-guess your own. Even if their claims are exaggerated or entirely fabricated, their tone, posture, and presence are crafted to make you feel smaller, less informed, and less capable. Humans naturally equate confidence with competence, and manipulators exploit this reflex with precision. What makes authority bias exploitation so powerful is the way it taps into childhood conditioning. From a young age, we are taught to obey teachers, parents, leaders, and those who seem to know the rules. As adults, those early lessons don't disappear, they transform. We still feel pressure to respect authority figures even when they haven't earned it. Manipulators understand this perfectly. They adopt the posture of someone who is never wrong. They quote obscure facts, use complex language, or reference vague credentials to make you feel inferior. The goal is simple: to make their voice louder in your mind than your own. Over time, you begin to rely on them for decisions you would normally make yourself. You defer to their judgment, believing they have more experience or insight. When you disagree, they make you feel naive or irrational. When you hesitate, they accuse you of being ungrateful or difficult. They frame their dominance as guidance, their control as protection, their superiority as necessity. Slowly, you lose trust in your own thoughts and start believing that without their direction, you would make catastrophic mistakes. This manipulation is especially devastating because it doesn't just change what you do, it changes what you believe. You begin to see their opinions as facts, their choices as the right choices, their worldview as the only reasonable one. Your reality becomes dependent on their approval. And once you internalize that hierarchy, once you believe they know better than you, the manipulation becomes self-sustaining. They no longer have to push, you willingly follow. Authority bias, exploitation appears in relationships, workplaces, cults, and even political systems. It is the tactic of bosses who belittle employees into obedience, partners who position themselves as the rational one, leaders who silence questions by appearing infallible. The emotional impact is profound. You start to feel incapable of making independent decisions. You wait for permission. You seek validation. You fear disappointing them more than you fear betraying yourself. What makes this tactic so psychologically suffocating is the way it erases your confidence, one subtle moment at a time. You start to believe that your thoughts are flawed, your instincts unreliable, your perceptions distorted. The manipulator doesn't just claim authority, they rewrite your internal compass so completely that you begin to follow them, even when every part of you whispers that something feels wrong. Normative Social Influence. Normative social influence is one of the most quietly powerful psychological forces shaping human behavior because it uses your deepest instinct, the need to belong, as a leash. At its core, it is the pressure to conform, not because you believe something is right, but because you fear the consequences of standing out, being rejected, or disappointing the group around you. It is the invisible current that pulls you toward the expectations of others, even when those expectations conflict with your values, your intuition, or your sense of identity. This influence often begins subtly, long before you realize it's happening. You adjust your opinions to match the room. You laugh at things that don't amuse you. You downplay parts of yourself to avoid judgment. You exaggerate other parts to gain approval. These small compromises feel harmless at first, almost automatic, because humans are wired to seek connection. Throughout evolution, belonging meant survival, and isolation meant danger. That ancient instinct still lives inside you, urging you to fit in, even at the cost of authenticity. Manipulators, groups, and even social environments exploit this wiring by creating standards that feel mandatory, unspoken rules you must obey to remain accepted. They reward compliance with approval, attention, and inclusion. They punish deviation with silence, disapproval, or subtle ridicule. Before long, you start monitoring your words, your actions, even your emotions, trying to align yourself with what the group desires. You become hyper-aware of your place in their hierarchy, constantly scanning for signs of acceptance or rejection. One of the most powerful aspects of normative social influence is how it shapes identity. The more you adapt to the expectations around you, the more distant you become from your own internal compass. You stop asking what you want and start asking what will keep you liked. You begin to value yourself not for who you are, but for how well you perform socially. This erosion happens quietly, disguised as getting along or being easygoing, but underneath it lies a growing fear that your true self might not be enough. Normative social influence becomes especially dangerous when used deliberately. Manipulative individuals or groups create environments where acceptance is conditional, where approval is rationed, where belonging is treated as a privilege you must earn. They make you feel that any slip, any disagreement, any hint of independence could cost you connection. This fear is powerful enough to make people ignore red flags, suppress discomfort, and tolerate behaviors they would otherwise reject. It makes you complicit in your own silencing. What makes this form of influence emotionally destabilizing is the quiet desperation it creates. You start to feel split between who you are and who you think you must be. You sense the pressure building beneath every interaction, but you tell yourself it's normal, that everyone feels this way, that blending in is easier than standing alone. And yet, with each compromise, you feel a subtle grief, the loss of your own voice, the fading of your own identity. Normative social influence doesn't force you with threats or commands. It persuades you with the fear of being unchosen, unnoticed, or unaccepted. It teaches you that the cost of being yourself might be the loss of the very connection you crave. The Scarcity Heuristic. The Scarcity Heuristic is one of the most emotionally charged psychological tactics because it hijacks a fundamental human fear, the fear of losing something valuable before we ever get the chance to claim it. At its core, the Scarcity Heuristic works by creating the illusion that something is rare, limited, or disappearing, which instantly makes it seem more desirable, more important, and more urgent than it truly is. When people believe that time, opportunity, or access is slipping away, rational thinking begins to collapse, and instinct takes over. Scarcity doesn't just influence decisions, it overrides them. This manipulation triggers an ancient survival response. For most of human history, resources truly were scarce: food, shelter, protection, allies. Losing access to any of these could mean danger. Our brains evolved to prioritize what might vanish, pushing us toward quick decisions meant to secure our place before someone else took it. Manipulators exploit this instinct by manufacturing a sense of rarity, making what they offer feel like a once-in-a-lifetime chance, even when it isn't. Scarcity amplifies desire not because the thing is inherently valuable, but because losing it feels emotionally threatening. This tactic often begins subtly. Someone might imply that their attention is limited, their affection rare, their time scarce. A relationship manipulator may hint that others would be lucky to have them, that they don't give second chances, or that emotional access to them must be earned. They create the feeling that you must act fast or risk losing them forever. The urgency they generate makes you cling tighter, invest more, and overlook red flags simply because the fear of missing out feels more real than the discomfort in your gut. In other situations, scarcity shows up through artificial time pressure. This opportunity won't last. I won't wait forever. If you don't decide now, it's gone. These statements work because they corner you emotionally. They eliminate the space you need to think clearly. The manipulator knows that if you had time to reflect, you might say no, so they take that time away. They make the moment feel fragile, fleeting, impossible to pause, because urgency weakens resistance. The scarcity heuristic also appears through selective availability. Someone may withdraw their attention, affection, or approval just enough to make you chase it. They may offer small glimpses of closeness, but pull away the moment you reach for it. The inconsistency fuels obsession, making their limited presence feel more precious than steady affection ever would. When something is rationed, you start to feel lucky for every small piece you receive, even if those pieces are crumbs. What makes the scarcity heuristic so emotionally gripping is how it distorts perception. You start to believe that losing the manipulator, the opportunity, or the relationship would be devastating, even if deep down you know it is hurting you. Scarcity makes you focus on what you might lose, not on what you're already sacrificing. It blinds you to the cost of staying, because the fear of missing out feels larger than the pain of holding on. And the cruel truth behind this tactic is that the scarcity was never real. The urgency was staged, the rarity was fabricated, the fear was planted. Scarcity doesn't show you what something is worth. It shows you how easily your heart can be manipulated when someone convinces you that what they offer might disappear forever. The halo effect. The halo effect is one of the most deceptively powerful psychological biases because it convinces people to see others not as they truly are, but as a reflection of a single positive trait. It begins with one shining impression: beauty, confidence, charm, intelligence, success. And from that one spark, the mind creates an entire illusion. The brain fills in the blanks, painting the person as kinder, more honest, more capable, more trustworthy than they may actually be. It is a mental shortcut that feels comforting, but it blinds you to red flags waving right in front of you. The halo effect takes advantage of our longing for certainty. When we meet someone who impresses us in just one way, our minds eagerly build a narrative around them. If they're attractive, we assume they must be good-natured. If they speak well, we assume they must be intelligent. If they seem successful, we assume they must be disciplined and reliable. These connections are automatic, unconscious, and deeply emotional. You don't reason your way into the halo effect. You feel it, and that emotional pull makes it dangerously easy for manipulators to exploit. This bias works because it taps into ancient survival instincts. Throughout human evolution, quick judgments were necessary, deciding fast who was safe, who was strong, who could be trusted. The brain still uses those shortcuts, but in the modern world, they can lead you straight into the arms of someone who weaponizes your assumptions. Manipulators understand how much power lies in first impressions. They curate their image, their charm, their confidence, their appearance, knowing that once the halo forms, everything they do afterward will be filtered through that glowing lens of positivity. Once the halo is established, contradictions don't shatter it. They get ignored. You excuse their harsh words because they seem like such a good person. You forgive their inconsistencies because you believe they wouldn't do anything wrong on purpose. You overlook their selfishness because you've already convinced yourself they're generous. The halo effect makes you rewrite reality. You edit out the bad, amplify the good, and cling to the image you've created rather than seeing the person standing right in front of you. What makes this bias so emotionally gripping is the way it intertwines admiration with vulnerability. When you admire someone, you naturally want your admiration to be justified. You want them to deserve the pedestal you've placed them on. That desire blinds you, binding your self-esteem to the belief that your judgment was right. And the more invested you become in believing the illusion, the harder it becomes to accept the truth. The halo effect can turn into a psychological cage built out of your own hopes, your own projections, your own idealizations. One of the most devastating aspects of the halo effect is the moment it breaks. When the illusion collapses, the emotional impact hits with a startling force. You feel betrayed, foolish, confused, shaken by the realization that someone you trusted had never earned that trust at all. But the heartbreak doesn't come from who they were. It comes from the painful awareness that your mind helped them hide in plain sight. The Horn Effect. The Horn Effect is one of the most quietly destructive psychological distortions because it turns a single negative impression into a lens that colors everything a person says or does. Instead of seeing someone as a complex human being with strengths and flaws, the mind fixates on one perceived flaw and magnifies it until it becomes their entire identity. This cognitive bias doesn't just warp perception, it reshapes relationships, self-worth, and the power dynamic between the one judging and the one being judged. It is the art of reducing a person to their worst moment and using that reduction to control them. This manipulation begins the moment the manipulator identifies something they can frame as a weakness, an insecurity, a mistake, an imperfection, or a behavior they can twist into fault. They latch onto it, emphasize it, repeat it, and highlight it until it becomes the defining trait in your mind. Over time, you begin to believe that this single flaw overshadows everything else about you. You hear it in their comments, feel it in their disappointment, and sense it in their body language. The manipulator uses that flaw like a brand, burning it into your self-image. What makes the Horn Effect so powerful is how easily it triggers shame. Humans are wired to seek social approval and fear rejection, and the idea of being fundamentally flawed is emotionally devastating. When someone constantly reminds you of your mistakes or shortcomings, you start to internalize those judgments. You become defensive, anxious, self-conscious. You overcorrect. You apologize for things that don't require apology. You begin to believe you are the problem, even when the problem was exaggerated or manufactured. The manipulator uses this emotional vulnerability to gain control. Once you believe you are flawed, they can position themselves as the one who tolerates you, guides you, corrects you, or helps you improve. It becomes easier for them to win arguments by pointing back to your supposed defect. It becomes easier for them to dismiss your feelings because they've convinced you that you're overreacting, irrational, or too emotional. It becomes easier for them to undermine your confidence because you already doubt yourself. The Horn Effect is emotionally devastating because it traps you in a distorted self-image. You begin to see yourself through their critical eyes. You focus on every slip, every fault, every imperfection, while overlooking your strengths. You shrink your personality to avoid reinforcing the negative trait they've assigned to you. You try to prove yourself, to redeem yourself, to correct what they've insisted is wrong with you. But manipulators don't want resolution. They want the imbalance. They want the guilt. They want the power that comes from you believing you're never quite good enough. Over time, this distortion becomes a psychological cage. You expect criticism before it arrives. You judge yourself before they even have to. You silence your opinions because you believe they don't carry weight. You accept treatment you don't deserve because you've been conditioned to think you deserve less. The Horn Effect doesn't just warp how they see you, it warps how you see yourself. And that is what makes it one of the most emotionally paralyzing tactics of manipulation. It convinces you that your flaw defines you, even when the flaw was never truly yours to begin with. Projection manipulation. Projection manipulation is one of the most mind-twisting psychological tactics because it turns your reality upside down by forcing you to carry the emotional baggage that doesn't belong to you. Instead of taking responsibility for their own flaws, insecurities, or harmful behaviors, the manipulator pushes those traits onto you, making you the problem, you the guilty one, you the one who needs to change. It is a deliberate distortion of truth designed to make you question your own character while protecting theirs. This tactic usually begins with subtle accusations that feel strangely misplaced. They accuse you of being selfish at the exact moment they are acting self-centered. They claim you're being dishonest while they're hiding things from you. They tell you that you're overreacting as they escalate the tension. At first, the accusations seem confusing, almost ironic, but projection works because it hits you emotionally before you can analyze it logically. You start defending yourself, explaining yourself, proving yourself, while they never have to confront their own wrongdoing. Projection manipulation is powerful because it weaponizes vulnerability. Most people are willing to reflect on themselves, consider their actions, and admit when they're wrong. The manipulator uses this openness against you. They exploit your willingness to self-examine, knowing that you will internalize their accusations more easily than they ever would. Instead of recognizing their projection, you start to wonder if you truly are the selfish one, the insecure one, the controlling one. You begin to carry the shame that actually belongs to them. Over time, this tactic erodes your self-trust. Your inner voice becomes quieter as theirs becomes louder. Every time they act out, they blame you. Every time they feel insecure, they accuse you of causing it. Every time they lash out emotionally, they insist that you provoked them. And because projection often happens during heated or emotional moments, your defenses are weakened, making their twisted version of the story easier to believe. Slowly, you start editing your behavior to avoid being blamed again, even though the blame was never yours to begin with. Manipulators rely on projection because it gives them two powerful advantages. They escape accountability and they keep you destabilized. As long as you are busy doubting yourself, you won't question them. As long as you feel guilty, you won't hold them responsible. As long as you think you're the cause of every problem, they remain untouchable. It becomes a psychological cage where every argument ends with you apologizing and them walking away untouched, unexamined, and unchallenged. The emotional devastation of projection manipulation lies in how deeply it infiltrates your sense of identity. When the same accusations are repeated over and over, they sink in. You begin to rewrite your own narrative with their words. You start believing you are the toxic one, the unstable one, the difficult one. And in that moment, the manipulator wins, not by proving you wrong, but by convincing you to abandon your own truth. Projection doesn't just distort reality, it steals it from you. It replaces your understanding of yourself with a version crafted to benefit someone else, leaving you questioning who you are and how you became the villain in a story you never wrote. Rationalization pressure. Rationalization pressure is one of the most psychologically exhausting manipulation tactics because it forces you to explain, justify, and defend your own reality until you begin doubting it yourself. At its core, this technique pushes you into a mental corner where you feel compelled to make sense of someone else's harmful behavior, to excuse what feels wrong, and to reshape your discomfort into something logical. Instead of the manipulator taking responsibility for their actions, they push you to twist your own thoughts until their behavior seems acceptable, even when every instinct in your body is screaming that it isn't. This tactic often begins with subtle questioning. If you confront something that hurts you, they respond with disbelief, confusion, or condescension, as if your emotional reaction is the real problem. They might ask, "Why would you think that?" Or, "Do you really believe I do something like that?" Or, "What's wrong with you today?" These questions are not meant to find answers. They're meant to make you feel irrational for having the reaction you did. You start trying to explain yourself instead of explaining their behavior. You begin to justify your feelings instead of expressing them. Over time, rationalization pressure shifts the emotional weight onto you. Instead of simply saying they hurt you, you find yourself constructing careful explanations, rehearsing conversations in your head, and triple-checking whether your reaction is valid. The manipulator uses this moment of uncertainty to reshape the narrative. They minimize what happened, shift blame onto your tone or timing, or argue that you're misunderstanding everything. The more you try to prove why something felt wrong, the more they make you feel like the one at fault for even noticing it. This tactic works because humans desperately want things to make sense. When something feels painful or confusing, the mind naturally searches for logic to ease the discomfort. Manipulators exploit this instinct by creating situations that feel wrong, then demanding explanations that make you feel foolish, dramatic, or unreasonable. You become trapped in a cycle of overthinking while they sit comfortably in the position of emotional authority. Your confusion becomes their camouflage. Rationalization pressure is especially damaging because it erodes your internal compass. You begin to second-guess your intuition. You apologize for normal reactions. You rewrite your own narrative to fit their version of events. The more you bend your reality to accommodate theirs, the more disconnected you become from your own truth. Eventually, you start rationalizing their behavior automatically, without them even having to push. You defend them to yourself. You justify their coldness, their anger, their neglect, their inconsistencies. You convince yourself that there must be a reason they acted that way, and that reason must somehow be your fault. What makes rationalization pressure so emotionally devastating is how subtly it steals your sense of self. Little by little, you stop trusting your own perceptions. You start believing that your emotions are unreliable, that your needs are unreasonable, that your memories are flawed. You feel the growing heaviness of carrying responsibility that was never yours to hold. And the manipulator knows that once you begin explaining away their harm, once you begin smoothing over their rough edges, once you begin rewriting reality to make them easier to love, they no longer need to convince you that you're wrong. You start convincing yourself. Withholding affection is one of the most emotionally destabilizing manipulation tactics because it turns love, comfort, and warmth into a form of currency, one that only the manipulator controls. Instead of expressing affection freely and naturally, they choose carefully when to give it and when to take it away, creating an unpredictable emotional landscape that keeps you constantly off balance. It transforms what should be a source of security into a source of anxiety. And the cruelest part is how easily the victim begins to believe that the loss of affection is somehow their fault. This tactic often begins subtly. At first, affection feels genuine, even overflowing. The manipulator offers warmth, attention, and closeness effortlessly, making you feel valued and deeply connected. But over time, that affection becomes conditional. A minor disagreement, a simple request, or a moment of independence from you suddenly triggers distance. They pull back, they grow cold, they stop responding with the same warmth they gave so easily before. They don't have to say anything. The silence becomes the message. The withdrawal becomes the punishment. Because humans are wired to seek connection and avoid rejection, this abrupt shift hits hard. The brain instinctively tries to repair the bond. You replay conversations in your mind, searching for mistakes. You blame yourself for their coldness. You try harder, speak softer, sacrifice more, hoping to bring back the warmth you once received effortlessly. The manipulator doesn't have to ask for more. You give more because you're terrified of losing what already feels half gone. What makes withholding affection so powerful is the psychological conditioning it creates. Your mind begins to associate certain behaviors with emotional loss. You learn, without being explicitly told, which actions make them withdraw and which actions make them return to being loving. The affection becomes a reward. The coldness becomes a threat. And you, without realizing it, start to shape your behavior around keeping them emotionally satisfied. Their approval becomes the compass you navigate your life by. Over time, this dynamic erodes your sense of self. You begin to believe that love must be earned. You start to feel undeserving whenever affection is withheld. Moments of warmth feel like relief rather than connection. The manipulator becomes both the source of the pain and the source of the relief. a psychological loop that keeps you deeply attached even as you're being emotionally starved. This cycle is the same mechanism used in trauma bonds, where intermittent affection binds you more tightly than constant love ever could. One of the most heartbreaking effects of withholding affection is how it distorts your understanding of intimacy. You start to equate love with anxiety, closeness with uncertainty, bonding with instability. You learn to tiptoe around emotional landmines, constantly monitoring your words, your tone, your actions, terrified that one wrong move will make the warmth disappear again. The person who should make you feel safe instead trains you to fear their distance. Withholding affection doesn't just hurt in the moment. It rewrites the way you love, the way you trust, and the way you see yourself. It takes the most human need we have, the need for connection, and turns it into a tool of control, leaving you emotionally hungry for the very person who keeps you starving. The foot in the mouth technique. The foot in the mouth technique is one of the most deceptively gentle manipulation tactics because it hides its agenda beneath politeness, empathy, and casual conversation. It works by creating a moment of psychological vulnerability, usually through a simple, disarming question, then using your response to guide you toward compliance. It is the tactic of getting you to say something that emotionally commits you before you even realize you've been cornered. In essence, it turns your own words into a trap you walk into willingly. It often starts with an innocent question, something soft and human like, "How are you doing today?" or "You're doing okay, right?" The moment you respond, especially if you answer positively, you unknowingly shift into a state of friendliness, cooperation, and lowered resistance. The manipulator isn't interested in your well-being. They're interested in the emotional door that opens when you verbally align yourself with harmony. Once you express that you're fine, or good, or doing well, they move to the real request, the part they wanted all along. And now, because you've just presented yourself as agreeable, it becomes emotionally harder to contradict that image by saying no. This tactic works so well because humans crave internal consistency. When you say you're doing good, your brain subtly nudges you to behave in a way that matches that statement. Saying no can feel like disrupting the harmony you just claimed to be in. The manipulator exploits this cognitive tension, counting on the fact that people avoid feeling hypocritical or unkind. The technique tricks you into compliance not through pressure, but through emotional momentum. You've already signaled a cooperative state, and now you unconsciously act in alignment with it. What makes the foot in the mouth technique so emotionally manipulative is how personal it feels. The manipulator acts warm, kind, attentive, someone who takes a moment to acknowledge you before asking anything of you. It feels human, even caring. That faux connection softens your guard, making you more likely to view their request as reasonable, even if it isn't. The emotional shift happens so fast that you don't notice the trap tightening around your own words. You think you're making a free choice, when in reality, the choice was shaped the moment you answered their initial question. Over time, this technique can condition you to behave more compliantly around the manipulator. You may find yourself saying yes to things you don't want, simply because you don't want to break the emotional rhythm they craft. You begin to feel like declining, even politely, would make you appear rude or inconsistent. The manipulator knows exactly how to exploit this internal discomfort. They ask soft questions, show interest, mirror warmth, and then leverage your emotional openness to get what they want. This tactic is especially dangerous because it appears harmless. It doesn't feel like manipulation, it feels like dialogue. But that is precisely why it works so well. You lower your defenses willingly. You walk into the emotional frame they set, and by the time you sense the subtle pull toward compliance, you've already been nudged into a state where saying no feels unnatural, abrasive, or guilt-inducing. The foot in the mouth technique uses your own words to guide your behavior, and once you speak the first sentence, The rest becomes far easier for them to control. The "that's not all" technique. The "that's not all" technique is one of the most deceptively persuasive psychological tactics because it doesn't push you, it pulls you in with a sense of excitement, urgency, and the illusion of getting more than you asked for. At its core, this technique works by presenting an offer and then sweetening it before you have the chance to respond. The sudden addition of more creates a burst of emotional momentum that makes you feel lucky, privileged, and compelled to accept. It's the manipulation of generosity, engineered to make you say yes before your logic has time to intervene. It usually begins with a proposition that seems reasonable, maybe even appealing, but not quite irresistible. Before you have a chance to weigh it properly, the manipulator interrupts your thinking with a surprise twist, an added bonus, a discount, a favor, an improvement. They frame it as if they're doing something special just for you. But wait, that's not all. Becomes the cue for your brain to switch from cautious evaluation to eager anticipation. Suddenly, you're not just receiving an offer, you're receiving a gift, and gifts trigger gratitude, excitement, and a desire to reciprocate. The reason this technique works so powerfully is rooted in the psychology of reciprocity. When someone appears to give you more than expected, your mind feels a subtle pressure to give something back, even if that gift is actually a calculated manipulation. The bonus feels exclusive, personal, tailored. It makes you feel chosen, valued, and seen. And that emotional rush clouds your ability to recognize the real intention behind the generosity, securing your compliance. Manipulators use the "that's not all" technique because it prevents the target from entering a state of resistance. Instead of pushing against your objections, they sweep you into a moment where you feel like rejecting the offer would mean rejecting the kindness attached to it. It's a psychological shortcut that bypasses your rational mind and taps directly into your emotions. You feel flattered, you feel grateful, you feel like you're about to miss out on something special if you hesitate. Over time, this tactic trains you to expect sudden bonuses and unexpected favors, making you more receptive to manipulation wrapped in positivity. The manipulator might do small acts of kindness, offer spontaneous upgrades, or give you small concessions just before making their real request. These gestures soften your resistance, making you more agreeable, more flexible, more willing to say yes. The emotional high of receiving extra becomes a conditioned response, one the manipulator can trigger anytime they want something from you. What makes the "that's not all" technique emotionally gripping is how it turns generosity into a weapon. You find yourself accepting things you wouldn't normally accept, agreeing to terms you didn't fully consider, or committing to situations that don't truly benefit you, all because you felt honored by an additional perk that was engineered to sway your emotions. The manipulator doesn't force you. They make you feel like you're gaining something special, even when the true gain is theirs. This technique doesn't rely on pressure or intimidation. It relies on excitement, surprise, and the intoxicating feeling of receiving more than you expected, turning your gratitude into their leverage. Ingratiation is one of the most deceptively charming forms of psychological manipulation because it disguises control beneath warmth, admiration, and strategic kindness. It works by making you feel appreciated, valued, and emotionally safe, only to use that goodwill as leverage later. At its core, ingratiation is not genuine affection. It is calculated likability. The manipulator's goal is simple: to become someone you want to please, someone you feel drawn to help, someone you hesitate to oppose. By winning your favor, they gain access to your trust and your compliance. This tactic often begins with tailored flattery, but it's not the shallow kind that feels exaggerated or insincere. This flattery is precise, intimate, and personal. The manipulator compliments things you're self-conscious about, recognizes qualities you wish others noticed, and praises strengths you didn't even realize were visible. They make you feel seen in a way that warms your chest and softens your instincts. People fall for ingratiation because it strikes at the deepest human need, to feel valued. And when someone seems to value you so deeply, you instinctively want to value them back. Ingratiation also works through strategically performed kindness. The manipulator offers help when you least expect it, supports you when you're stressed, and goes out of their way to appear generous. They make small sacrifices that feel meaningful and thoughtful, but each gesture is a brick in the psychological foundation they're building. By doing things for you, they subtly create a sense of debt. Not a debt you consciously acknowledge, but one you feel. You begin to think you owe them your patience, your flexibility, your agreement. Their kindness becomes the rope that gently ties you to them. The emotional power of ingratiation lies in the way it shapes your perception. When someone consistently flatters you, supports you, and treats you well, you naturally assume their intentions are pure. You let your guard down. You overlook small red flags. You give them the benefit of the doubt again and again because your brain keeps reminding you of how good they've been to you. Manipulators know this. They know that if they make you like them enough, if they make you admire them, trust them, feel grateful to them, it becomes significantly harder for you to see their actions objectively. Over time, ingratiation shifts into something more controlling. Once your affection is established, the manipulator begins to make requests, push boundaries, or express expectations that you never agreed to. And because they've been so warm and supportive, saying no feels uncomfortable, almost wrong. You fear disappointing them. You fear seeming ungrateful. You fear breaking the harmonious connection they have so carefully built. The manipulator understands this emotional tension and uses it to their advantage. They no longer need to demand anything. You give it willingly because you've been conditioned to want to please them. What makes ingratiation so emotionally gripping is how natural it feels. You don't realize you're being influenced because it doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like connection. You feel drawn to them, trusting of them, even protective of them. Their approval starts to matter more than you expected. Their disappointment starts to sting more than it should. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your desire to keep them happy begins to overshadow your desire to keep yourself safe. Emotional flooding. Emotional flooding is one of the most overwhelming psychological manipulation tactics because it hits you with such an intense wave of emotion, anger, desperation, panic, or even affection that your mind shuts down before you can react logically. It's the strategic drowning of your emotional system, a deliberate overload that leaves you too stunned, too confused, or too distressed to think clearly. When someone uses emotional flooding, they don't want a conversation. They want control. They want your defenses down, your judgment impaired, and your ability to respond reduced to pure instinct. This tactic often begins suddenly and without warning. One moment the situation seems manageable, and the next you're engulfed in a tidal wave of emotion that feels impossible to process. The manipulator raises their voice, cries uncontrollably, accuses you of things you didn't do, or unleashes a torrent of blame, guilt, or dramatic declarations. The intensity doesn't allow you to breathe or think or step back. They overwhelm you so completely that your nervous system goes into survival mode. When a person is emotionally flooded, the brain shifts out of rational thinking and into a fear-driven state. Your heart races, your thoughts blur, your body tenses, and you feel trapped by the moment. In this state, you stop focusing on the truth or the situation. You focus on relieving the emotional pressure, and that's exactly what the manipulator counts on. They know that if they can make their emotions big enough, you'll abandon your own perspective just to calm them down. Emotional flooding is especially powerful because it turns the manipulator's feelings into your responsibility. You begin trying to fix their emotional storm, even when you did nothing wrong. You apologize just to restore peace. You agree just to stop the chaos. You silence yourself to avoid triggering another eruption. Over time, your brain begins to link their emotional explosions with your behavior, training you to walk on eggshells and predict their reactions before they happen. You start shaping your entire emotional world around avoiding their storms. One of the most dangerous aspects of emotional flooding is how it rewrites your sense of stability. The manipulator's emotional highs and lows become the rhythm of your relationship, and you adjust without realizing how much of yourself you're sacrificing. You begin to anticipate the next eruption, preemptively changing your tone, your choices, your boundaries to prevent the flood. You lose your sense of autonomy because the emotional climate is always changing, and you're always bracing for impact. What makes emotional flooding so heartbreaking is the way it masks itself as passion, vulnerability, or sincerity. The manipulator might insist they can't help it, that they're just emotional, that they care too much, making you feel cruel for wanting stability. But the truth is that emotional flooding is not about expression. It's about overpowering. It's about drowning your clarity in their chaos, forcing you to surrender not through logic or persuasion, but through sheer emotional exhaustion. Emotional flooding doesn't just shake you in the moment. It conditions you to believe that staying silent is safer than being honest, that compliance is easier than confrontation, and that suppressing your truth is the only way to avoid being swept away again. Toxic positivity. Toxic positivity is one of the most emotionally invalidating forms of manipulation because it disguises itself as encouragement, optimism, and support while slowly suffocating your ability to feel, express, or process anything real. It's the relentless insistence on good vibes only, the pressure to smile through pain, and the refusal to acknowledge discomfort, injustice, or suffering. Instead of helping you heal, toxic positivity traps you in a psychological cage where negative emotions are treated like personal failures, and your humanity becomes something you're expected to filter out. It begins subtly, often with words that seem comforting on the surface. You'll be fine. Just stay positive. It could be worse. But beneath those phrases is a message that cuts deep. Your pain is inconvenient. Your struggles are unnecessary, and your emotions are something you should suppress. The manipulator uses positivity not as a tool for support, but as a shield to avoid responsibility, accountability, or empathy. They present themselves as uplifting, but their refusal to acknowledge your feelings leaves you emotionally isolated. What makes toxic positivity so psychologically harmful is the way it turns genuine emotions into sources of shame. You start to question yourself, wondering whether your sadness, anger, or fear means you're weak or dramatic. You try to push your feelings down to meet the impossible standard the manipulator sets, and the more you suppress, the heavier your emotions become. You begin to hide your struggles, silence your needs, and pretend everything is fine because you're afraid of being judged for simply being human. The manipulator benefits from this emotional silence. When you stop expressing your discomfort, they avoid difficult conversations. When you minimize your pain, they avoid accountability for their actions. Toxic positivity becomes a barrier that protects them from having to confront the consequences of their behavior. They can say they're being supportive while refusing to engage with any problem that might require effort, responsibility, or empathy. Your emotional suppression becomes their emotional convenience. Over time, this constant dismissal of your negative feelings creates a deep sense of loneliness. You start to feel disconnected from your own internal world because you're always trying to perform happiness. You smile when you want to cry. You laugh when you feel empty. You say you're okay because you've learned that vulnerability will only be met with platitudes. Toxic positivity turns real emotional connection into a performance, and you become the actor who's trapped in a role you never auditioned for. What makes this tactic so emotionally triggering is how subtly It erodes your ability to trust yourself. When every painful emotion is met with forced optimism, you begin to doubt your instincts. You question whether your discomfort is justified. You convince yourself that expressing your truth will burden others. Slowly, you internalize the idea that you must earn love or acceptance by being endlessly cheerful, endlessly resilient, endlessly lighthearted, even when your world feels heavy. Toxic positivity doesn't heal pain, it buries it. And the more deeply pain is buried, the more power it has over you. The manipulator's constant insistence on staying positive becomes a way to silence your voice, smother your authenticity, and isolate you behind a mask of manufactured happiness that protects everyone except the person wearing it. Gaslighting by omission. Gaslighting by omission is one of the most insidious forms of psychological manipulation because it doesn't distort reality with lies. It distorts it with silence. Instead of fabricating stories, the manipulator carefully removes pieces of the truth, leaving you with gaps, contradictions, and confusion that you are forced to fill in on your own. And without all the information, your mind becomes a maze of second-guessing, self-blame, and emotional exhaustion. It is a tactic that erodes your trust not only in the other person, but in your own perception of what is real. This form of gaslighting begins quietly. They forget to mention important details. They accidentally leave out information that would change the meaning of a situation. They tell you part of a story, but not the part that matters. They share only the fragments that make them look good, innocent, or justified. You sense something is missing, but you can't prove it because technically they didn't lie. They just didn't tell you everything. And that's what makes it so incredibly destabilizing. The power of gaslighting by omission lies in the confusion it creates. When you only have half the truth, your mind fills the empty spaces with assumptions, possibilities, and fears. You start questioning your reactions. Maybe you misunderstood, maybe you're overthinking, maybe you're being dramatic. The manipulator uses your uncertainty as a shield, positioning themselves as reasonable while you appear emotional or paranoid. They rely on your desire to be fair, to avoid accusing someone without proof, to give people the benefit of the doubt. Your own empathy becomes the fog that blinds you. Gaslighting by omission is often paired with selective transparency. The manipulator shares just enough honesty to appear trustworthy, while removing the parts that might incriminate them or validate your concerns. They give you breadcrumbs of truth, just enough to make you doubt your intuition when you feel something is off. Every time you question them, they point to the parts they did tell you, using their partial honesty as evidence that they are doing nothing wrong. Meanwhile, the missing pieces continue to distort the full picture. Over time, this form of gaslighting reshapes your internal world. You start to doubt your instincts. You begin to feel insecure about your memory, your judgment, and your emotional responses. You second-guess whether you have the right to feel hurt or suspicious. You start apologizing for reactions that anyone else with the full truth would find completely valid. The manipulator counts on this self-doubt. The less you trust your own mind, the more you will rely on their version of events. What makes gaslighting by omission so emotionally devastating is how invisible it is. It doesn't leave you with the shock of a blatant lie. It leaves you with the slow, quiet ache of uncertainty. You feel like something is wrong, but you can't name it. You feel like you're being misled, but you don't know how. You feel lost, but you don't know where the map went missing. And the manipulator exploits this vulnerability by claiming innocence, making you feel unreasonable for noticing the very gaps they created. Gaslighting by omission doesn't erase the truth. It buries it. It hides it beneath silence, half answers, and conveniently missing details, leaving you to doubt yourself until you no longer recognize your own instincts as real. Strategic invalidation. Strategic invalidation is one of the most emotionally corrosive manipulation tactics because it slowly dismantles your confidence, your voice, and your sense of emotional reality. Rather than attacking you outright, the manipulator chips away at your inner world by dismissing your feelings, downplaying your experiences, and questioning your perceptions in moments when you are most vulnerable. It is not accidental, and it is not misunderstanding. It is calculated erosion, designed to make you doubt yourself so deeply that you begin turning to the manipulator for clarity, approval, and permission to feel. This tactic often begins in moments when you seek comfort or express discomfort. You open up about something that hurt you, and instead of being met with understanding, you hear, "You're overreacting," or "It's not that big of a deal," or "You're so sensitive." These words sting, not because they're loud, but because they strike your softest places. Strategic invalidation makes you feel foolish for having normal human emotions. It teaches you that your inner world is inconvenient, dramatic, or wrong. And once you start believing that, you instinctively silence yourself. Manipulators use invalidation because it grants them enormous psychological power. If they can convince you that your emotions are unreliable, they become the authority on what's reasonable. If they can make you doubt your own reactions, they gain control over your boundaries. If they can shame you into minimizing your feelings, they can behave however they want without consequences. Strategic invalidation is not about misunderstanding. It is about neutralizing your ability to push back. Over time, the tactic becomes more subtle and more damaging. The manipulator doesn't have to call you dramatic anymore. They simply raise an eyebrow, sigh, or give you a look that makes your stomach drop. They dismiss your hurt with a joke, an eye roll, or a wave of the hand. They make you feel childish for wanting reassurance, needy for expecting compassion, or ridiculous for expressing pain. Slowly, you stop sharing. You swallow your emotions. You apologize for feelings that any healthy person would understand. You internalize the belief that something is wrong with you for experiencing what you feel. What makes strategic invalidation especially destructive is how deeply it reshapes your identity. You begin to distrust your instincts, second-guess your judgments, and rewrite your own memories to match the manipulator's version of events. When you feel hurt, you question whether you're allowed to be. When something feels wrong, you wonder if you're imagining it. When you try to set boundaries, you feel guilty and unreasonable. The manipulator doesn't have to deny your feelings anymore. You start denying them yourself. And beneath all of this is a quiet, aching loneliness. You feel unheard, unseen, and emotionally abandoned. You start believing that your emotions burden people, that your needs are excessive, that your desires are misguided. This emotional suppression becomes a cage you build around yourself, one you lock from the inside because someone convinced you that your feelings are too much. Strategic invalidation doesn't just silence you, it convinces you that your silence is justified. It steals your emotional truth and replaces it with a version that keeps the manipulator comfortable and keeps you small. Blame shifting. Blame shifting is one of the most disorienting and emotionally corrosive manipulation tactics because it takes the natural human instinct to self-reflect and twists it into a weapon. Instead of taking responsibility for their actions, the manipulator redirects fault onto you, subtly at first, then relentlessly. Over time, you begin to question your judgment, your memory, your reactions, and eventually, your own worth. Blame shifting doesn't just distort the truth, it distorts your entire sense of reality. It often starts with small deflections. The manipulator makes a mistake, hurts your feelings, or crosses a boundary, but instead of owning it, they immediately turn the spotlight on you. If you're upset, they claim you're too sensitive. If they lie, they insist you misunderstood. If they lash out, they accuse you of provoking them. Every time you try to express your feelings, they twist your words until you're the one apologizing for reacting at all. What should be a simple acknowledgement of wrongdoing becomes a psychological maze where you're always the one at fault. Blame shifting works because it preys on your empathy and your willingness to self-examine. If you're the kind of person who cares about how your actions affect others, the manipulator exploits that. They know you'll replay conversations in your head, searching for what you might have done wrong. They know you'll doubt yourself before doubting them. And each time you bend to their accusations, you reinforce their control. Your guilt becomes their shield. Your confusion becomes their immunity. Over time, this tactic begins to poison your self-esteem. You start to internalize their accusations, believing you truly are the cause of every argument, every silent treatment, every emotional storm. You become hyper-aware of your behavior, constantly trying to avoid triggering another round of blame. You walk on eggshells, censoring your emotions and shrinking yourself to prevent conflict. But no matter how careful you are, the manipulator always finds a way to make you responsible for their actions. The goal isn't resolution, it's power. One of the most suffocating aspects of blame shifting is how it isolates you from your own truth. When someone consistently rewrites events and assigns you the role of the problem, you lose the ability to trust your perceptions. You begin questioning your memory, your intentions, even your morality. The manipulator becomes the narrator of your reality, and you become a character they can rewrite as they please. This erosion of self-trust is what keeps you stuck, unable to challenge the cycle, because you're no longer confident in your own voice. What makes blame shifting especially painful is how it disguises itself as logic. The manipulator speaks with certainty, insists their version makes more sense, and uses your hesitation as proof that they're right. They may even accuse you of being dramatic, irrational, or unfair, projecting their behavior onto you until you carry the weight of emotions that were never yours to begin with. By the time you realize what's happening, you're buried under layers of guilt that were manufactured to control you. Blame shifting doesn't just steal accountability from the manipulator, it steals clarity from you. It replaces honest communication with psychological fog, turning every conflict into a trap where your good intentions become evidence against you. And the hardest part is recognizing that the guilt you feel was never yours to hold in the first place. Victim playing is one of the most emotionally manipulative psychological tactics because it twists sympathy into power and turns compassion into a weapon. Instead of taking responsibility for their actions, the manipulator paints themselves as the wounded, betrayed, or misunderstood party, forcing you into the role of rescuer, caretaker, or even villain. It is the tactic of shifting blame through self-pity, using emotional suffering as a shield, and bending the narrative until you feel guilty for things you didn't do and responsible for pain that isn't yours to carry. It often begins with subtle signals. The manipulator sighs dramatically, withdraws, or makes vague comments about feeling hurt or mistreated. They don't directly communicate what's wrong. They wait for you to notice. They want you to ask questions, to console them, to fall into their emotional orbit. The moment you show concern, they begin shaping the story. They frame themselves as misunderstood, neglected, or attacked. They exaggerate small slights into emotional injuries and twist neutral events into proof that they are constantly wronged. This tactic works because humans are wired to respond to suffering. Empathy is natural, but victim players exploit empathy for control. They weaponize their fragility, turning every conflict into a guilt trap. If you bring up something that bothers you, they dissolve into tears or silence. If you set a boundary, they claim you are abandoning them. If you hold them accountable, they insist you're being cruel or insensitive. The manipulator transforms legitimate issues into emotional battlefields where you're forced to comfort them instead of addressing the real problem. Over time, victim playing conditions you to abandon your needs in order to protect their feelings. You start avoiding tough conversations because you know they will crumble or explode. You hesitate to express frustration because they will shift the guilt onto you, making you feel heartless. You begin to feel like you're constantly walking on emotional shards, terrified of causing pain even when you've done nothing wrong. The manipulator's suffering becomes the center of the relationship, and your emotional world shrinks to accommodate their drama. What makes victim playing so psychologically suffocating is the way it rewrites the roles in the relationship. You become the caretaker, the apologizer, the fixer. They become the wounded soul who needs saving. The more you try to help them, the more power they gain. The more guilt you carry, the easier it becomes for them to steer your choices. Eventually, you stop asking for anything at all. You stop complaining. You suppress your feelings to avoid triggering another storm of self-pity. And while you're busy tending to their emotional theatrics, your own needs quietly starve. The most chilling part of victim playing is how it can make you question your reality. When someone constantly claims you hurt them, even with no intent or evidence, you begin to wonder whether you truly are the problem. You doubt your memory, your intentions, your emotional validity. Their suffering becomes proof that you must be doing something wrong. The manipulator counts on these doubts. They thrive on the confusion, because a person who feels guilty is a person who can be controlled. Victim playing doesn't just distort the truth, it reshapes your identity. It turns you into the caretaker of someone who refuses to take responsibility for their own actions. It drains your empathy, erodes your confidence, and traps you in a cycle where the more you give, the more you're blamed. And the most painful part is that the person claiming to be the victim is often the one causing the deepest wounds. Emotional mirroring. Emotional mirroring is one of the most profoundly disarming psychological tactics because it doesn't manipulate your actions. It manipulates your feelings. Instead of copying your gestures or words, the manipulator reflects your emotional state back at you so convincingly that you begin to feel deeply understood, intensely bonded, and psychologically exposed in ways you never intended. At its core, emotional mirroring is the art of becoming your emotional twin, shaping the connection so that you feel like you found someone who feels exactly as you do, even when that connection is strategically manufactured. It often begins at a moment when you're vulnerable, excited, or expressing something meaningful. As you reveal your emotions, your fears, your dreams, your insecurities, the manipulator immediately adopts the same emotional tone. If you're heartbroken, they echo your sadness. If you're passionate, they mirror your enthusiasm. If you're scared, they reflect the same anxiety. This emotional synchronization creates an illusion of profound compatibility, making you believe the two of you share a rare, almost spiritual connection. It feels effortless, intimate, and safe. But emotional mirroring works not because it reflects truth, but because it reflects you. Humans are drawn to emotional familiarity. When someone appears to feel what you feel, you instinctively trust them. Your guard lowers. You open up more. You reveal deeper thoughts, deeper wounds, deeper desires. And the manipulator absorbs every bit of this emotional information, not to comfort you, but to use it as a blueprint. Your emotional landscape becomes their script. What makes emotional mirroring especially potent is the speed at which it builds attachment. Real emotional alignment takes time, but mirroring creates a shortcut. You start to believe that this person gets you in ways no one else ever has. You feel seen, you feel validated, you feel connected, and connection built on emotional reflection rather than genuine compatibility feels magical at first. But beneath that magic is manipulation designed to anchor your loyalty. Once the bond is formed, the manipulator begins to shift their emotional responses strategically. They may suddenly withhold emotional mirroring after giving it so consistently. This abrupt disconnection hits like a cold shock, leaving you confused and craving the warmth of the emotional closeness they created. Your mind becomes fixated on getting that connection back. You replay conversations trying to understand what changed. You try harder, open up more, give more, hoping they will return to the emotional resonance you once felt. And that longing gives the manipulator enormous psychological power. Emotional mirroring doesn't just bond you, it conditions you. It teaches you that emotional harmony comes from the manipulator, and emotional discomfort comes from you. This dynamic makes it easy for them to influence your decisions, your boundaries, and even your beliefs. When they mirror joy, you feel safe. When they withdraw it, you feel lost. Your emotional stability becomes tied to their behavior, creating a dependency you never intended to form. What makes emotional mirroring so emotionally gripping is the betrayal hidden inside it. It takes one of the most intimate human experiences, the feeling of being understood, and turns it into a tool for control. You aren't bonding with a kindred soul. You're bonding with a reflection crafted to capture you. And when that reflection shifts, you're left questioning yourself, wondering how something that felt so real could unravel so easily, never realizing that the emotions you trusted were never theirs. They were your own, mirrored back at you with precision and purpose. Projection accusation. Projection accusation is one of the most psychologically disorienting manipulation tactics because it doesn't just shift blame, it weaponizes your empathy, your self-doubt, and your willingness to take accountability. Instead of confronting their own destructive behaviors, the manipulator hurls them at you with conviction, accusing you of the very things they are guilty of. It is a tactic designed to confuse you, destabilize you, and make you carry the emotional weight they refuse to acknowledge. At its core, projection accusation is a psychological mirroring twisted into a weapon, forcing you to defend yourself against crimes you never committed. It often begins during tension, conflict, or moments when the manipulator feels exposed. If they've lied, they accuse you of dishonesty. If they're being selfish, they claim you only think about yourself. If they feel guilty, insecure, or caught, they flip the emotional spotlight back onto you. Suddenly, you're the one being interrogated. You're the one being challenged. You're the one scrambling to prove your innocence. By the time you start explaining yourself, the manipulator has already escaped responsibility and placed you on the defensive. Projection accusation works because it hits you in a place where you are most vulnerable, your desire to be a good person. You question yourself because self-reflection is natural to you. The manipulator knows this. They rely on your willingness to examine your own behavior, even when the accusations make no logical sense. The more you care, the more these accusations cut into your sense of identity. You start replaying conversations in your head, wondering if you said something wrong, wondering if you missed something, wondering if their claims might actually be true. Over time, the tactic becomes a psychological trap. Every conflict becomes a mirror turned towards you. Every problem becomes something you supposedly caused. Your reality becomes cluttered with accusations that don't belong to you, but that you feel pressured to defend yourself against. The emotional exhaustion builds slowly, like a constant hum of guilt vibrating beneath the surface of your mind. You start apologizing just to make the argument stop. You concede to things you didn't do because the fight feels impossible to win, and in doing so, you surrender pieces of yourself. What makes projection accusation so emotionally brutal is how it distorts your sense of truth. When the same accusations are repeated with enough intensity, you start doubting your instincts. You begin to wonder if your perception is flawed, if your memory is unreliable, if your intentions are as questionable as they claim. You feel a fracture growing inside you between what you know happened and what they insist happened. And in that gap, your confidence slowly erodes. Manipulators use projection accusation not just to dodge accountability, but to create chaos inside your mind. The confusion keeps you compliant. The guilt keeps you quiet. The emotional turmoil keeps you too distracted to question their motives. Every accusation becomes another thread they wrap around you, tying you tighter to their narrative while untethering you from your own. Projection accusation doesn't just distort reality, it replaces it. It forces you to defend yourself against shadows crafted from someone else's darkness until you no longer recognize what was theirs and what they've convinced you is yours. Triadic Manipulation. Triadic manipulation is one of the most cunning and deeply destabilizing psychological tactics because it doesn't just involve you and the manipulator. It introduces a third person as a tool of control. Instead of confronting you directly, the manipulator uses someone else's presence, opinions, or reactions to influence your emotions, decisions, and behavior. It's a triangle built not for stability, but for imbalance, where the manipulator stands at the top, pulling the strings while you're left trying to navigate an emotional labyrinth created for you to lose your footing. Triadic manipulation often begins quietly. The manipulator brings another person into the dynamic in subtle ways, mentioning what that person supposedly said about you, comparing you to them, or suggesting that this third party agrees with their criticisms. It may sound harmless, even casual, but its purpose is deliberate, to make you question yourself through the imagined eyes of someone else. The manipulator knows that people care deeply about how they're perceived, and by invoking a third perspective, they amplify your self-doubt without ever seeming like the aggressor. As the pattern deepens, the manipulator positions themselves as the mediator between you and this third person. They present themselves as the one with access to secret opinions, hidden judgments, or unspoken truths. This dynamic gives them incredible psychological power because you begin relying on them for information about how others see you. They can praise you by claiming others admire you, or they can cut you down by insisting others are disappointed in you. In both scenarios, they control the narrative because the third person is rarely involved directly. Most of the time, they don't even know they're being used. Triadic manipulation becomes especially destructive when the manipulator pits you against someone else, creating tension or competition that only they can resolve. They may act differently with each person, presenting one as favored and the other as problematic. This subtle triangulation forces you into a constant state of emotional comparison, always wondering where you stand, always trying to prove your worth. The manipulator thrives in the resulting chaos because as long as the two bottom points of the triangle are misaligned or mistrustful of each other, no one ever looks up to see who's orchestrating the divide. One of the most emotionally damaging elements of triadic manipulation is how deeply it infiltrates your sense of belonging. Humans are wired for connection, and the idea that someone else might secretly judge you or be preferred over you triggers powerful insecurities. The manipulator takes advantage of this by controlling access to approval. They create alliances and exclusions in shifting patterns, keeping you eager for reassurance that never fully arrives. Over time, you begin to base your self-worth on how well you can maintain your standing in this manufactured triangle. Perhaps the darkest aspect of triadic manipulation is the way it erodes trust, not just in the manipulator, but in the third person and eventually in yourself. You start to question people who have done nothing wrong. You grow suspicious, anxious, or competitive without understanding why. The manipulator doesn't just distort your relationship with them, they distort your relationship with others and with your own intuition. And by the time you realize you've been pulled into a game you never agreed to play, the lines between truth, lies, and perception have already been blurred beyond recognition. Self-deprecation to elicit comfort. Self-deprecation to elicit comfort is one of the most deceptively disarming manipulation tactics because it disguises control beneath vulnerability. Instead of demanding reassurance outright, the manipulator presents themselves as fragile, insecure, or emotionally wounded, inviting you to step in and soothe them. It is the art of using self-criticism not as honesty, but as bait. Each negative remark about themselves is crafted to provoke your empathy, trigger your nurturing instincts, and pull you deeper into an emotional role you never chose, the one responsible for keeping them together. It often starts softly. The manipulator makes a comment like, "I'm such a burden. I don't think anyone really likes me," or "I'm probably not good enough for someone like you." These statements are not expressions of real vulnerability. They're emotional fishing lines. They wait for you to react, for you to rush in and contradict their self-doubt. The moment you reassure them, they feel a surge of control. They've discovered your emotional pressure point, the guilt you feel when someone is hurting. From that moment on, your comfort becomes their currency. What makes this tactic so powerful is how natural it feels to respond. Humans instinctively want to ease others' pain, especially when the pain seems internal and raw, but the manipulator relies on this instinct, using it to bond you to them through constant caretaking. Each time they belittle themselves, you feel compelled to lift them back up. Each time they crumble, you patch their pieces together. Slowly, without realizing it, you become the emotional stabilizer in the relationship, while they position themselves as the forever fragile one who needs saving. Over time, this pattern becomes exhausting, yet you keep participating because every time you hesitate, their self-deprecating remarks grow heavier, more dramatic, more emotionally demanding. If you don't comfort them quickly enough, they may suggest that you don't care, that you're abandoning them, or that they were right to think they're not worth anyone's time. The guilt hits hard. You scramble to reassure them again, not noticing how your emotional energy is being drained by their stage fragility. This tactic becomes even more manipulative when used in conflict. If you try to express a boundary or frustration, the manipulator instantly collapses into self-criticism. "I ruin everything. I guess I'm just the worst person. You must hate me." Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about the issue at hand. It's about comforting them. They've shifted the emotional weight back onto you, making you feel cruel for addressing your needs. The original concern gets buried beneath their performance of self-loathing. What makes this tactic so psychologically suffocating is the slow erosion of your emotional autonomy. You begin to anticipate their collapses. You soften your tone, suppress your concerns, and tiptoe around your own feelings because you fear triggering their next self-attacking spiral. You learn to manage their emotions at the expense of your own. You become the caretaker of someone who uses weakness as a leash, and each time you offer comfort, the leash tightens. The true cruelty of using self-deprecation to elicit comfort is that it turns your empathy into a trap. The manipulator creates a dynamic where you feel responsible for their self-worth, where you mistake their emotional dependency for intimacy, and where you lose sight of the fact that real vulnerability invites connection, while weaponized vulnerability demands compliance. Manipulative comparison. Manipulative comparison is one of the most psychologically cutting tactics because it doesn't attack your actions, it attacks your worth. Instead of confronting you directly, the manipulator subtly compares you to someone else in a way that makes you feel inadequate, insecure, or desperate to prove yourself. It's a tactic designed to create emotional pressure by placing you beside an idealized version of another person, making you feel like you're constantly falling short. And the cruelest part is that it often sounds harmless on the surface, disguised as advice, concern, or casual observation. It usually begins with innocent-sounding comments. They mention how effortlessly someone else handles things you struggle with, how someone else never reacts the way you do, how someone else always seems to get it right. These comments linger in your mind long after the conversation ends, burrowing into your self-esteem. You start replaying them, wondering why you're not enough, why you can't be like the person they've placed on a pedestal. And that self-questioning is exactly what the manipulator wants, because the moment you start comparing yourself, you start chasing their approval. Manipulative comparison works by creating an emotional hierarchy where you are always positioned beneath someone else. The manipulator crafts comparisons that make you feel lacking in the exact areas where you're already vulnerable. If you're sensitive, they praise someone for being calm. If you're ambitious, they admire someone's success. If you're insecure, they highlight someone's confidence. The comparisons are never random. They target your weak spots with surgical precision. The manipulator knows exactly which qualities you value, and they hold those qualities just out of reach. Over time, this tactic reshapes your behavior. You begin striving to become the version of yourself they seem to want, adjusting your personality, your choices, even your identity to avoid being compared unfavorably again. You try harder, you give more, you bend yourself into shapes that hurt, and each time you fall short of the impossible standard set by their comparisons, they tighten the emotional leash a little more. You start to feel that love, approval, or peace is something you have to earn because someone else is always doing it better. One of the most devastating aspects of manipulative comparison is how deeply it erodes your self-worth. You stop seeing your strengths because you're too focused on the traits you supposedly lack. You stop recognizing your progress because they keep holding you against someone who appears perfect. You begin to believe that you are fundamentally flawed, unlovable, or insufficient unless you become more like the person they keep mentioning. This creates a cycle of emotional competition where the only prize is temporary relief from feeling inadequate. What makes this tactic so emotionally traumatic is the way it twists your desire to be valued into a source of pain. You're not just compared, you are diminished. You're not just encouraged, you are pressured. You're not just inspired, you are invalidated. And because the comparisons often come wrapped in a calm tone or a casual remark, you question your right to feel hurt. You wonder if you're overreacting. You convince yourself that they're just trying to help. But deep down, a quiet ache grows, a sense that no matter what you do, it will never be enough. Manipulative comparison doesn't motivate growth. It manufactures insecurity. It takes your natural longing to be appreciated and turns it into a relentless pursuit of approval that was designed to stay just out of reach, leaving you chasing validation that was never meant to be yours. Over-personalization. Over-personalization is one of the most quietly corrosive manipulation tactics because it turns every neutral moment, every casual comment, and every harmless event into something that is supposedly about you. It warps your perception until you begin to believe that your actions, your words, even your presence are constantly causing problems. At its core, over-personalization is the art of making you feel responsible for things that were never yours to carry. It is emotional distortion disguised as sensitivity, weaponized to make you walk through life as if every step might crack the ground beneath someone else. This tactic often begins in subtle, almost invisible ways. You mention a thought, and the manipulator sighs as if you've wounded them. You express a preference, and they act offended, as though you've rejected them personally. Even small moments, your tiredness, your silence, your need for space, become sources of conflict because they twist those moments into statements about them. Suddenly, your emotions are no longer yours to feel. They become reflections of how you supposedly feel about the manipulator. You find yourself apologizing for things you never intended, bending to avoid hurting someone who seems hurt by everything. Manipulators rely on over-personalization because it creates emotional pressure that never eases. You start monitoring your expressions, filtering your words, editing your reactions in real time, terrified that anything you say or do might trigger another emotional storm. This constant vigilance drains you, reshapes you, and makes you smaller. You become hyper-responsible for their feelings, for their moods, for their interpretations of the world. And in that state, exhausted, cautious, and afraid to misstep, you become easier to control. Over-personalization works so powerfully because it targets your empathy. Most people care about the impact they have on others, and manipulators exploit this caring nature. They twist ordinary human moments into emotional offenses, forcing you to question your intentions, your kindness, and your character. Every sigh becomes a reprimand. Every glance becomes a problem. Every attempt to be yourself becomes something you feel guilty for. Instead of asking whether you've actually done something wrong, you start assuming you have. What makes this tactic so deeply damaging is the way it reshapes your emotional landscape. You stop trusting your own intentions because they've convinced you that you hurt people without realizing it. You second-guess your smallest impulses. Laughing too loudly, talking too softly, taking too long to reply, choosing something they don't prefer. Each hesitation chips away at your authenticity. Each moment of self-silencing becomes another victory for the manipulator. And beneath this constant pressure grows an ache that is difficult to describe, the feeling that being yourself is somehow harmful, that your emotions inconvenience people, that your needs burden them, that your existence requires constant apology. This internalized guilt becomes a powerful leash, tightening every time you consider expressing a boundary or standing up for yourself. You begin to believe that the safest version of yourself is the smallest one. Over-personalization doesn't just make you responsible for someone else's emotions. It makes you responsible for their interpretations, their insecurities, and their wounds. It blurs the line between their inner world and your own until you no longer know where their feelings end and your guilt begins. Silent assumption imposition. Silent assumption imposition is one of the most quietly suffocating psychological manipulation tactics because it doesn't rely on confrontation, pressure, or threats. It relies on unspoken expectations that you feel obligated to meet. Instead of stating their needs, desires, or beliefs openly, the manipulator behaves as if their assumptions are already true, already agreed upon, already your responsibility. They build a silent narrative where your role is predetermined, your reactions are expected, and your compliance is assumed, without ever giving you the chance to consent or even question it. This tactic begins subtly. The manipulator starts acting as though certain decisions have already been made, as though you've already agreed to things you never discussed. They speak as if your priorities align perfectly with theirs. They assume your time belongs to them, your loyalty is guaranteed, your boundaries are flexible, your sacrifices are automatic. And because nothing is said out loud, you find yourself slipping into the role they silently constructed for you without realizing when you stepped into it. Silent assumption imposition works because it bypasses direct communication and replaces it with psychological pressure. You sense that you are expected to comply, even though no words were exchanged. The manipulator may reference plans you never made, count on commitments you never gave, or act disappointed when you don't fulfill expectations you never agreed to. The emotional weight falls on you, not because you did anything wrong, but because they created a reality where your no feels like a betrayal, even though your yes was never asked for. What makes this tactic especially cruel is the way it uses your empathy against you. You feel guilty for disrupting expectations that were never spoken. You feel compelled to avoid letting them down, even though you were never part of the decision. You begin to adjust your behavior to meet assumptions that were never negotiated. The manipulator relies on your discomfort with conflict, your kindness, your desire to be reliable. They know you'll try to uphold the unspoken rules simply to avoid the emotional tension that comes with resisting them. Over time, silent assumption imposition begins to reshape your identity in the relationship. You stop expressing your preferences because the manipulator's assumptions overshadow them. You stop asserting boundaries because the expectations are woven so seamlessly into your interactions that breaking them feels unnatural. You learn to anticipate their silent demands before they arise. You become responsible not just for meeting their needs, but for preemptively fulfilling their imagined version of you. One of the most emotionally damaging aspects of this tactic is how it steals your autonomy. The manipulator never forces you. They simply behaves as though your choices don't exist. They erase your individuality without ever lifting their voice. And because the pressure is unspoken, you struggle to explain why you feel trapped. There's no explicit demand you can point to, no argument you can replay, no moment where they clearly overstepped. The manipulation hides in the spaces between words. Silent assumption imposition doesn't just control your actions, it controls the story of who you are allowed to be. It pushes you into a silent contract you never sign, leaving you carrying the weight of expectations that were never yours to hold in the first place. Appeal to pity. The appeal to pity is one of the most emotionally coercive manipulation tactics because it uses suffering, real or fabricated, to override logic, boundaries, and fair judgment. Instead of persuading through truth or accountability, the manipulator floods the situation with sympathy, positioning themselves as the fragile, wounded figure who must be protected at all costs. It is the strategy of turning vulnerability into leverage, twisting compassion into obligation, and making you feel heartless if you dare to stand your ground. It usually begins with a dramatic emotional display at the exact moment they feel challenged, questioned, or denied. Suddenly, the conversation shifts from the issue at hand to their pain, their struggles, their tragic backstory. They recount every hardship they've ever experienced, emphasize their emotional exhaustion, or paint themselves as someone life has relentlessly beaten down. The goal is simple: to make you feel so overwhelmed by their suffering that you abandon your point entirely. Your logical stance dissolves under the weight of their narrative. This tactic works because humans are deeply empathetic creatures. We are wired to respond to distress, to step in when someone cries, to comfort those who appear broken. The manipulator weaponizes that instinct. They use emotion to cloud your judgment, to make you question your own needs, and to tilt the power dynamic in their favor. The moment you soften, hesitate, or comfort them, the shift begins. Your boundaries fade. Their influence grows. They learn that tears and tragedy can silence any objection. Over time, the appeal to pity becomes their escape hatch from accountability. Whenever they hurt you, they redirect the conversation to how hurt they are. Whenever you express frustration, they counter with how you don't understand their burdens. Whenever you ask for change, they crumble into a portrayal of someone too wounded to meet your expectations. You become trapped in a cycle where your emotions are invalidated while their emotions dominate. You are no longer dealing with the issue, you are managing their reaction to it. What makes this tactic so emotionally exhausting is that it makes you feel responsible for their pain. You begin to worry that holding them accountable will break them. You fear that saying no will cause them to spiral. You hesitate to set boundaries because every boundary becomes another chance for them to portray themselves as the victim of your supposed coldness. Slowly, your empathy becomes a tool they manipulate, and your guilt becomes the chain that keeps you compliant. The appeal to pity is especially dangerous because it reshapes your perception of fairness. You start to feel like their suffering gives them special rights to your time, your patience, your energy, your sacrifices. You start giving more than you can afford emotionally because you've been conditioned to believe that your pain matters less than theirs. You overlook their behavior, excuse their cruelty, and forgive their manipulation simply because you feel sorry for them. The emotional impact is devastating. You lose your ability to trust your own boundaries. You feel drained, responsible, conflicted, and every time you try to reclaim your power, they remind you, subtly or dramatically, that you are hurting someone who is already hurting. The appeal to pity becomes their shield, their mask, their emotional weapon. And the cruelest part is that the more you care, the more deeply the tactic sinks into you until compassion becomes the very thing that keeps you trapped. The red herring tactic. The red herring tactic is one of the most disorienting psychological maneuvers because it doesn't confront your concerns, it diverts them. Instead of addressing the issue at hand, the manipulator throws something irrelevant, dramatic, or emotionally triggering into the conversation to drag your attention away from the truth. It is a tactic designed to confuse, derail, and overwhelm you until you forget what you were originally questioning. At its core, the red herring tactic is the art of misdirection, turning your search for clarity into a maze of distractions that leave you feeling lost, frustrated, and unsure of what's real anymore. It often begins the moment you ask a direct question or bring up a legitimate concern. Instead of responding, the manipulator suddenly shifts the focus. They bring up an unrelated problem, a past mistake of yours, a fabricated emergency, or someone else's behavior entirely. The topic changes so quickly and so dramatically that your mind scrambles to keep up. By the time you realize the conversation has veered off track, you've already been pulled into defending yourself, soothing them, or dealing with the new issue they manufactured. The original question, the one they didn't want to answer, disappears into the background. The red herring tactic works because humans are wired to respond emotionally to unexpected turns. When the manipulator introduces a new problem with urgency or intensity, your brain instinctively shifts into reaction mode. You forget about logic. You forget about sequence. You forget that this wasn't even what you were talking about. The emotional jolt hijacks your ability to analyze, and the manipulator exploits this gap to escape accountability. They don't have to lie. They just have to make sure the truth gets buried beneath enough noise. Over time, this tactic conditions you to stop bringing up concerns altogether. You begin to anticipate the exhausting detours, the frustrating diversions, the emotional storms that erupt whenever you try to express yourself. You start feeling guilty for even asking simple questions, because every time you try, the manipulator makes it about something else. Your tone, your timing, your past, their stress, their needs. The conversation becomes a battlefield where clarity is impossible and truth is always out of reach. Eventually, silence feels easier than attempting to navigate the chaos. One of the most emotionally damaging aspects of the red herring tactic is the internal confusion it creates. You walk away from conversations feeling disoriented, wondering how the topic shifted so drastically, why you ended up apologizing, why nothing was resolved. This confusion wears you down. It makes you doubt your memory, your communication skills, even your sanity. It convinces you that every conversation is too complicated to pursue, which is exactly what the manipulator wants, your quiet compliance. The red herring tactic doesn't just derail conversations, it derails your sense of certainty. It strips away your ability to trust your own perception of events. It transforms simple discussions into emotional labyrinths, leaving you so tangled in irrelevant arguments that you lose sight of the very truth you set out to uncover. It is a psychological smokescreen crafted to keep you chasing answers that were deliberately hidden the moment you dared to look for them. The straw man manipulation. The straw man manipulation is one of the most infuriating and destabilizing psychological tactics because it twists your words into something you never said, never meant, and never even implied. Instead of confronting your actual point, the manipulator reshapes it into a distorted, exaggerated, or completely false version, then attacks that version as if it were yours. It is a tactic designed to confuse you, frustrate you, and force you into defending yourself against arguments you never made. At its core, the straw man manipulation is not about understanding. It's about winning. It's about control. It's about making you look unreasonable so the manipulator never has to address the truth. This tactic often begins the moment you express a concern, a boundary, or a simple opinion. You might say something gentle like, "I'd like to talk about this later," and suddenly they respond with, "Oh, so now you don't care about this relationship at all?" You mention feeling tired, and they twist it into, "So you're saying I'm exhausting to be around?" You express a need, and they attack the exaggerated version of that need. Every nuance, every intention, every honest attempt at communication gets warped into an extreme that you cannot recognize. And suddenly, you're no longer discussing your point. You're frantically trying to correct their distortion. The straw man works because it throws you off balance emotionally. It creates a sense of disbelief that someone could twist your words so dramatically. That shock pulls you out of your original position and forces you into an emotional scramble, trying to repair the damage they've invented. You forget the conversation's purpose and get trapped in defending your character instead of addressing the real issue. This is exactly what the manipulator wants. If they can derail the conversation, they never have to face accountability, compromise, or self-reflection. Over time, the tactic becomes even more damaging because it makes you afraid to speak. You start tiptoeing around your own thoughts, terrified that anything you say will be used against you in a distorted form. You rehearse your words, over-explain, or stay silent altogether because you've been conditioned to expect your intentions to be twisted. This is how the straw man becomes a form of control. It punishes honesty until you stop being honest. What makes this manipulation emotionally brutal is the way it erodes your self-trust. When someone continuously misrepresents your thoughts, you begin questioning whether you explained yourself correctly, whether your feelings are unreasonable, whether you somehow triggered the distortion. You start absorbing blame for misunderstandings that were engineered, not accidental. The manipulator reinforces this by saying things like, "Well, that's what you meant," or "Don't try to backtrack now," as if they understand your intentions better than you do. Even worse, straw man manipulators often act outraged or wounded by the distorted thing they invented, forcing you into guilt for something you never actually did. You end up comforting the person who twisted your words, apologizing for things you never said, and abandoning the very concerns you tried to express. The conversation becomes a maze designed to trap you, not to communicate. The straw man manipulation doesn't just distort your message, it distorts your reality. It pulls you into emotional arguments you never started, makes you defend positions you never believed, and silences truths you were brave enough to speak. The double bind. The double bind is one of the most psychologically paralyzing manipulation tactics because it traps you in a no-win situation where every choice you make leads to punishment, disappointment, or accusation. It is a mental prison crafted with impossible expectations where the manipulator creates a reality in which you are guaranteed to fail. No matter what you say or do, you will be wrong. No matter how hard you try, you will fall short. And the most devastating part is how quickly you begin to internalize the idea that you are the problem rather than the trap you've been placed in. A double bind usually begins with two conflicting demands that cannot both be satisfied. The manipulator might tell you to be honest, then explode when you share the truth. They insist they want independence, then accuse you of not caring when you give them space. They urge you to speak your mind, then punish you for having an opinion. Each path leads to emotional backlash. Each reaction becomes evidence against you. The manipulator sets the rules, breaks the rules, rewrites the rules, and then blames you for not following them. This tactic works because it weaponizes confusion. The more the contradictions pile up, the more you question your instincts. You begin analyzing every word, every tone, every expression, desperate to choose the right option, even though no such option exists. Your nervous system starts bracing for impact, convinced that any decision could ignite conflict. The manipulator uses this anxiety to tighten their control. When you feel disoriented, They position themselves as the only stable reference point. They present themselves as the one who understands you, even though they're the one unraveling you. Over time, the double bind corrodes your ability to trust your own judgment. You become hypervigilant, scanning for clues that don't exist, trying to decode expectations that are intentionally contradictory. You learn to suppress your needs, silence your emotions, and bend your personality into whatever shape seems least likely to trigger backlash. But the trap keeps shifting, the target keeps moving, the emotional ground beneath you stays unstable. You lose more of yourself each time you try to adapt to demands that were designed to be unfulfillable. One of the most painful effects of the double bind is the guilt it creates. Because the manipulator punishes you regardless of what you choose, you start believing you're inherently flawed. You feel responsible for their mood swings, their disappointment, their anger. You apologize for things you didn't do. You accept blame for situations that were engineered to corner you. The more you try to fix the relationship, the deeper you sink into the belief that you are the reason everything keeps going wrong. The double bind doesn't just trap you, it rewrites your understanding of choice itself. It conditions you to believe that your desires are dangerous, your voice is unwelcome, and your independence is a threat. You end up living in a psychological chokehold where silence feels like the safest option and compliance feels like survival. And the most heartbreaking part is that the manipulator never intended for you to win. They only intended for you to surrender. Deny and counter-accuse. Deny and counter-accuse is one of the most psychologically devastating manipulation tactics because it turns the truth into a weapon and transforms accountability into chaos. Instead of owning their behavior, the manipulator immediately denies any wrongdoing, no matter how clear the evidence is, then shifts the spotlight onto you, accusing you of the very actions, intentions, or flaws you were trying to address in them. It is the tactic of emotional inversion, a deliberate attempt to make you feel guilty, confused, and defensive while they walk away untouched. It begins the moment you bring up a concern. You might approach them calmly, vulnerably, or with evidence in hand, hoping for understanding or resolution, but instead of listening, they shut the door on the conversation, a firm, emotionless denial that makes you question whether you even have the right to speak. They say things like, "I never did that," "You're imagining things," or "That never happened." The denial is not just rejection, it is an attempt to erase your reality completely. Before you can process the shock of being dismissed, the manipulator strikes again. They flip the narrative, accusing you of the exact behavior you confronted them about. If you mention their dishonesty, they call you the liar. If you point out their disrespect, they claim you're the one who's been hurtful. If you express how their actions affect you, they say you're attacking them. Their goal is to put you on the defensive so quickly that the original issue becomes buried beneath their counterattack. What makes deny and counter-accuse so emotionally damaging is the psychological whiplash it creates. You go from feeling hurt to feeling confused, then suddenly you're the one being blamed. You begin defending yourself against accusations that came out of nowhere, and in that frantic emotional scramble, the manipulator accomplishes exactly what they want. You abandon the original conversation entirely. Your focus shifts from seeking accountability to trying to prove you're not the villain they've painted you to be. This tactic works because it disorients your sense of emotional equilibrium. When someone denies your reality and then accuses you of the very harm they inflicted, your brain goes into overdrive trying to reconcile the contradictions. You question your perception, your memory, your tone, your intentions. You wonder whether you did do something wrong without realizing it. That doubt cracks open the door the manipulator needs, because a person who doubts themselves is much easier to control. Over time, deny and counter-accuse conditions you to stay silent. You stop addressing issues because you know the conversation will be twisted against you. You start tiptoeing around their behavior, protecting their comfort instead of protecting your truth. You learn that bringing up concerns only leads to emotional backlash, guilt, or conflict you don't have the strength to handle. In the process, your voice shrinks, your boundaries erode, and your self-trust fractures. What makes this tactic especially cruel is that it doesn't just distort arguments, it distorts your identity. You begin to internalize the accusations they throw at you. Their denial starts to make you question your own emotional intelligence. Their counterattacks make you feel like you are the toxic one, the problem, the unstable force in the relationship. Meanwhile, the manipulator walks away with a spotless self-image, having successfully redirected the blame. Deny and counter-accuse is psychological warfare disguised as conversation. It's the emotional equivalent of a smoke bomb, blinding you with confusion while the manipulator slips out of accountability, leaving you surrounded by doubt, guilt, and a version of events that never truly existed. The foot in the door via shared values. The foot in the door via shared values is one of the most persuasive and emotionally disarming psychological tactics because it doesn't start with a favor, it starts with alignment. Instead of asking for something outright, the manipulator first convinces you that the two of you share the same beliefs, morals, goals, or emotional principles. They build a bridge out of your deepest values, and once you walk across it, they slowly begin guiding you toward behaviors, commitments, or decisions you never would have agreed to on your own. It is a subtle tactic that exploits the human need for consistency, belonging, and moral identity. It begins simply, almost beautifully. They highlight the values that matter most to you: kindness, loyalty, fairness, ambition, honesty, and present themselves as someone who embodies those same principles. They echo your thoughts, finish your sentences, and react to the world with the same emotional intensity you do. It feels like you've met someone who finally gets you, someone who sees the world through the same lens. And that sense of shared purpose becomes the doorway through which the manipulation enters. Once the emotional connection is established through mutual values, the manipulator asks for something small, something that aligns perfectly with those values. If you care deeply about compassion, they ask you to make a tiny sacrifice to help someone. If you value loyalty, they ask you to take their side in a minor disagreement. If justice matters to you, they ask you to support them in something framed as the right thing to do. You agree, not because you're pressured, but because the request feels aligned with the person you believe yourself to be. That first yes is the opening they need. From there, the requests grow. Each one is still framed through your shared values, but gradually they begin to stretch the boundaries of what you're comfortable with. They ask for more time, more support, more sacrifices, each step justified by invoking the very principles you care about. They use your values as leverage, suggesting that if you don't agree, you might not be living up to your own standards. The manipulator blurs the line between being true to your values and serving their interests until the two feel indistinguishable. This tactic is especially powerful because it attaches your sense of moral integrity to the manipulator's approval. You start equating compliance with being a good person. You feel compelled to follow through, to stay consistent, to avoid feeling like a hypocrite. The manipulator doesn't have to pressure you. You pressure yourself. And the more you agree to, the harder it becomes to see where your values end and their agenda begins. What makes the foot in the door via shared values so emotionally destabilizing is the betrayal woven into it. You think you're acting out of your own principles, but slowly you realize you've been guided step by step into choices that don't feel like yours anymore. You look back and wonder how something that started with mutual connection and meaning turned into a path where you feel manipulated, obligated, and morally cornered. This tactic doesn't just use your values, it weaponizes them. It makes you question whether your moral compass led you astray, or whether someone else quietly tightened their grip while holding it in front of you, pretending it was still your own. Hypocrisy Induction. Hypocrisy Induction is one of the most psychologically punishing manipulation tactics because it turns your morality, your values, and your desire to be a good person into weapons against you. Instead of confronting the manipulator's behavior, the tactic flips the spotlight onto you, making you feel guilty, flawed, or hypocritical for even trying to hold them accountable. At its core, hypocrisy induction is emotional judo, using your own principles to knock you off balance, forcing you to question your integrity while the manipulator escapes responsibility untouched. This tactic often begins when you address a problem or express a boundary. Instead of listening, the manipulator instantly digs into your past, your mistakes, your weaknesses, or any moment, no matter how irrelevant, where you once acted imperfectly. You might gently say, "It hurts me when you talk to me that way," and they strike back with, "Oh really? Didn't you raise your voice last month, and now you want to lecture me?" The original issue disappears. Suddenly, you're defending your character instead of discussing their behavior. Hypocrisy induction works because it attacks the heart of something deeply human, the desire to be consistent, fair, and morally grounded. When someone suggests you're being hypocritical, it triggers a painful emotional reflex, a sense of shame, confusion, and self-doubt. You begin replaying your own actions, questioning whether you're being unreasonable, wondering if you've lost the right to express your feelings. The manipulator knows that if they can make you feel morally conflicted, you'll retreat, soften, or surrender. They don't need to prove they're right. They just need to make you feel wrong. Over time, this tactic trains you to silence yourself. Every time you try to address a concern, they weaponize your past. Every time you express hurt, they drag up unrelated mistakes. Every time you assert a boundary, they make you feel like you're in no position to set one. You start walking on eggshells, not because their behavior improves, but because you've been conditioned to believe you have no right to ask for better. The manipulator has trapped you in a psychological loop where you must be perfect to speak while they remain above scrutiny. What makes hypocrisy induction especially damaging is how deeply it erodes your internal sense of worthiness. You begin to see yourself through their distorted lens, as inconsistent, flawed, undeserving of understanding. You start apologizing for things that don't matter, excusing their behavior because you're too busy cataloging your own imperfections. You lose the ability to differentiate between genuine accountability and manufactured shame, and slowly, your moral compass stops guiding you. It starts punishing you. Manipulators use hypocrisy induction because it allows them to rewrite the emotional power dynamics. If you feel guilty, they gain control. If you feel morally flawed, they gain superiority. If you feel unworthy of expressing your needs, they get to act without consequence. The tactic doesn't just derail arguments, it destabilizes your identity. Hypocrisy induction doesn't hold you accountable, it holds you hostage. It traps you in a cycle where every effort to protect yourself becomes another opportunity for them to tear you down, leaving you questioning not just your actions, but your right to feel anything at all. Strategic forgetting. Strategic forgetting is one of the most subtly infuriating and psychologically destabilizing manipulation tactics because it disguises itself as harmless forgetfulness while quietly rewriting reality in the manipulator's favor. Instead of confronting you directly or denying their behavior outright, they simply don't remember the promises they made, the words they said, the boundaries they crossed, or the agreements you clearly had. And because forgetting seems innocent, you question your memory long before you ever question their intentions. This tactic often begins with small, convenient lapses. They forget an important detail that would hold them accountable. They forget a commitment that matters to you. They forget a conversation where they agreed to respect a boundary, or forget a moment where they hurt you. Each incident seems simple enough to overlook. After all, everyone forgets sometimes. But you soon realize their memory only fails when remembering would require responsibility, honesty, or follow-through. Their forgetfulness becomes selective, predictable in its convenience, and deeply inconvenient for you. Strategic forgetting works because it preys on your instinct to be fair. You don't want to accuse someone of lying if they truly just forgot. You don't want to start a conflict over something that might be a genuine lapse in memory. You hesitate, you soften, you repeat yourself, you let things slide, and each time you excuse their forgetfulness, you reinforce the effectiveness of the tactic. The manipulator learns that all they have to do to avoid accountability is claim they don't recall. Suddenly, they never said what you remember clearly. They never agreed to what you counted on. They never acted the way your emotions insist they did. Over time, their forgetting begins to erode your confidence. You start questioning your own recollection of events, replaying moments in your mind to see if you misunderstood. Your certainty begins to crumble as they calmly insist they have no memory of the things you're upset about. The manipulator's collected demeanor contrasts sharply with your rising frustration, making you look irrational while they seem reasonable. They use this dynamic to position themselves as the sane, grounded one, while quietly leading you to doubt your own reality. One of the most emotionally damaging aspects of strategic forgetting is the exhaustion it creates. You find yourself constantly reminding them of conversations, defending events you know happened, re-explaining how something made you feel, or trying to hold together a history they keep selectively erasing. You start to keep mental score because you're afraid they'll deny what you lived through. You become hyper-organized, hyper-aware, overly patient, or overly apologetic, just to compensate for their refusal to acknowledge the truth. Eventually, the manipulation works its way into your self-worth. You begin to wonder if you really are overly sensitive, forgetful, or confused. You shrink your expectations because they don't remember agreeing to them. You stop asking for what you need because you can't handle another round of denial disguised as innocence. You stop trusting your own memory because theirs always seems so conveniently blank. Strategic forgetting doesn't just rewrite the past, it rewires your present. It leaves you chasing clarity in a relationship where clarity is intentionally withheld, trapped in a cycle where every truth you try to hold on to slips through the cracks of someone else's selective memory, leaving you questioning the one person you should never doubt, yourself. Intermittent validation. Intermittent validation is one of the most emotionally addictive manipulation tactics because it traps you in a cycle of craving approval that comes unpredictably and inconsistently. Instead of offering steady support, affection, or acknowledgement, the manipulator delivers praise and warmth in irregular bursts, just enough to keep you emotionally invested, but never enough for you to feel secure. It is a psychological hook designed to make you chase the next moment of validation, even when most of the relationship feels cold, distant, or dismissive. It begins with moments of genuine seeming affection. The manipulator offers compliments, attention, or appreciation that feel meaningful and rare, like small treasures. These moments are powerful because they are sporadic. You never know when the next one will come, so when it does, it hits with the emotional force of relief, excitement, and hope. Your brain lights up, releasing dopamine that reinforces the connection, conditioning you to seek more of that fleeting warmth. Then comes the shift, the sudden withdrawal, the unexpected silence, the cold tone, the absence of acknowledgement. The behavior that once made you feel valued is replaced by indifference or irritation. You're left wondering what changed, what you did wrong, or how you can bring back the version of them who made you feel special. This confusion is not accidental. It is the core of the tactic. The manipulator knows that inconsistency creates obsession. Your emotional state becomes tied to their unpredictable approval, and slowly you begin to work harder for it. What makes intermittent validation so dangerous is how it rewires your expectations. You stop seeking stability and start settling for scraps. You reinterpret rare kindness as proof of deep care while ignoring or excusing long stretches of neglect. Your mind focuses on the highs and minimizes the lows, the same way gamblers remember the wins but forget the endless losses. This psychological pattern is what keeps casinos thriving, and it's what keeps victims of intermittent validation emotionally trapped. Over time, this conditioning creates dependency. You may find yourself altering your behavior, suppressing your needs, or overperforming emotionally in the hope of earning another moment of validation. You stop questioning their inconsistency and start questioning your own worth. Every compliment feels like salvation. Every cold moment feels like punishment. Your emotions become a tug of war between craving approval and fearing abandonment. This tactic becomes even more manipulative when used in conflict. The manipulator may offer sudden, unexpected warmth after long periods of emotional distance, making you feel guilty for even considering pulling away. They may give a rare compliment right when you're about to set a boundary. They may show affection when they sense you getting stronger. These calculated bursts of kindness are designed to reset your hope and keep you attached. What makes intermittent validation so emotionally devastating is the illusion it creates, a belief that the warm version of them is the real one and everything else is temporary. You cling to the rare moments of affection as evidence that the relationship can be good, that if you just try harder, love better, stay quieter, or give more, the consistency will eventually come. But the truth is that the inconsistency is intentional. The high you feel from their validation isn't love, it's psychological conditioning. Intermittent validation doesn't just manipulate your emotions, it chains your self-worth to someone who controls when, how, and if you ever feel valued again. Context collapsing. Context collapsing is one of the most mentally destabilizing psychological tactics because it strips your words, actions, and emotions from their original meaning and forces them into a distorted frame that benefits the manipulator. Instead of acknowledging the circumstances, nuance, or intent behind what you said or did, they yank your behavior out of its proper context and present it in a way that makes you look irrational, cruel, inconsistent, or untrustworthy. It is the art of turning a moment into a weapon, shaping a story that harms you by erasing everything that would have explained or defended you. This tactic often begins with a single statement or reaction you expressed in a very specific situation. Maybe you were stressed, maybe you were responding to something hurtful, maybe you were joking, maybe you were standing your ground. The manipulator takes that isolated moment and strips away all the surrounding circumstances. They ignore what triggered you, what you were responding to, or what emotions were involved. Instead, they present your reaction as if it happened in a vacuum, as if it represents your entire personality rather than a single moment in time. The power of context collapsing lies in how easily it can make the victim doubt themselves. When someone insists that your behavior means something terrible without acknowledging the full picture, you begin questioning your own memory and intentions. You wonder if you really were too harsh, too emotional, too impulsive. You replay the moment endlessly, trying to understand how they came to such a harsh interpretation. And the more you try to explain the context, the more they dismiss it, acting as though your explanation is an excuse rather than the missing truth. Manipulators use this tactic because it gives them complete control over the narrative. By collapsing the context, they get to define what your actions mean, and they always define it in a way that makes you the problem. They can frame your defensiveness as aggression, your boundaries as selfishness, your emotional pain as instability, your frustration as disrespect, and because the nuance has been erased, you're left with no way to defend yourself without sounding like you're overreacting or desperately trying to rewrite reality. Over time, context collapsing reshapes how you view your own behavior. You start policing yourself, afraid that anything you say or do will be twisted later. You become hyper-aware of your reactions, walking on eggshells to avoid giving them any material they can distort. You begin to shrink emotionally, speaking less, expressing less, trusting less. The manipulator doesn't have to humiliate you directly. You begin silencing yourself out of fear of how your actions will be reinterpreted. What makes context collapsing so emotionally suffocating is the way it isolates you from your own truth. You start feeling like your experiences don't matter, like your emotions are unreasonable, like your intentions are always suspect. The manipulator convinces you that the flattened version of the story, the version with all the nuance scraped away, is the only reality that counts. You begin to lose confidence in your own perception, relying more and more on their interpretation of events. Context collapsing doesn't just distort what happened, it distorts who you are allowed to be. When someone repeatedly strips away the circumstances surrounding your behavior, they steal your humanity and replace it with a caricature they can blame, punish, or control. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to live in a story that never belonged to you, trapped inside a narrative crafted to keep you small, silent, and endlessly apologizing for a version of yourself that never truly existed. Subtle threats, implied harm. Subtle threats or implied harm are one of the most chilling forms of psychological manipulation because they operate in the shadows, never stated outright, never spoken boldly, yet felt with unmistakable clarity. Unlike open aggression, subtle threats hide behind tone, implication, and unspoken danger. They make your stomach drop, your chest tighten, and your instincts flare, even though nothing explicit was said. That vagueness is what makes them so powerful. You feel fear, but you can't point to a single clear sentence that proves why. This manipulation begins in quiet moments, often disguised as jokes, offhand remarks, or emotional shifts that don't match the situation. You voice a concern, and they whisper, "I wouldn't push that if I were you." You set a boundary, and they say, "You don't want to make things difficult." They remind you of what you could lose. They make vague references to consequences, to disappointment, to people turning cold. They don't threaten your safety directly. They threaten your peace, your relationships, your reputation, your access to comfort. And because they never say it openly, you're forced to interpret the danger on your own. Subtle threats work because they activate instinct without providing clarity. Your body picks up on the tension long before your mind can categorize it. The manipulator leans on this instinctual fear, knowing that you will start avoiding conflict, not because they demanded it, but because you want to escape the looming sense of danger they created. You begin tiptoeing through conversations, filtering your words, surrendering your needs long before they become an issue. The threat doesn't need to be repeated. The feeling of it lingers. Over time, implied harm turns into a psychological leash. The manipulator uses tone, silence, or sudden mood shifts to signal disapproval, and you feel that old wave of dread wash over you. They don't need to raise their voice. They don't need violence. Their power lies in your anticipation of what could happen. Because the consequences are never clearly defined, your imagination fills in the gaps, often making the threat feel far more severe than any reality. The manipulator knows this. They rely on your fear of the unknown to keep you compliant. What makes subtle threats emotionally devastating is the isolation they create. You feel trapped, but you can't explain why. You feel unsafe, yet you struggle to justify that feeling to others or even to yourself. When you try to talk about it, you hear yourself repeating vague sentences like, "It's the way they said it," or "It just felt wrong," and even you begin doubting your instincts. This doubt is part of the trap. When fear cannot be named, it becomes harder to resist. Eventually, You begin associating your own needs, boundaries, and honesty with danger. Every time you consider speaking up, you recall the manipulator's subtle threat, the slight tightening of their jaw, the coldness in their eyes, the quiet sentence with heavy implications. And so you quiet yourself. You shrink. You choose safety over truth, peace over authenticity. They don't have to cage you. They simply guide you to build the bars yourself. Subtle threats and implied harm don't control you through force. They control you through fear wrapped in silence, shaping your behavior without ever revealing their hand. Induced dependency. Induced dependency is one of the most consuming and quietly predatory psychological manipulation tactics because it doesn't just influence your decisions, it slowly convinces you that you cannot function without the manipulator. It is the systematic removal of your confidence, your independence, your support systems, and your sense of self until your emotional survival feels tied to their presence. What makes this tactic so insidious is that it often disguises itself as love, protection, or support, while silently tightening its grip around every part of your life. This tactic usually begins with overwhelming helpfulness. The manipulator steps in during moments of vulnerability, offering guidance, resources, or emotional comfort at just the right time. They position themselves as the one person who truly understands you, the one who can solve your problems, the one who is always there for you when others aren't. They subtly make themselves indispensable, and you start relying on them more and more, believing it's mutual care rather than intentional control. The early stages feel like safety, not a trap. Over time, the manipulator begins to reshape your world. They may subtly discourage you from seeking advice from others, claiming those people don't get you or don't want what's best for you. They may gently criticize your choices until you stop trusting your own judgment. They may take over responsibilities in your life, finances, decisions, planning, until you're accustomed to letting them lead. You don't notice the shift because it doesn't feel forceful. It feels supportive. That is the brilliance and the danger of this tactic. Dependency doesn't feel like a cage until you try to step outside of it. As your reliance on them grows, the manipulator increases their influence. They insert themselves into your decision-making, making you second-guess your instincts. They offer unsolicited help that makes you feel incapable without them. They point out your flaws, weaknesses, or past failures under the guise of helping you grow. Slowly, you begin to see yourself as less competent, less stable, less capable than you actually are. And the manipulator positions themselves as the solution to the very insecurities they help create. Induced dependency becomes emotionally devastating when you begin to fear disappointment, conflict, or distance with them. You worry about making choices without their approval. You hesitate to express opinions that differ from theirs. You feel anxious when they're upset with you, afraid that without their support, you'll crumble. What once felt like love or loyalty transforms into a quiet panic at the thought of losing the one person who has become your emotional lifeline. The manipulator doesn't need to demand control. You offer it freely because you believe you need them. One of the most heartbreaking effects of induced dependency is how thoroughly it isolates you from yourself. You lose sight of your own strengths, your own resilience, your own ability to succeed. You become smaller in your own mind while the manipulator grows larger, more essential, more central to your existence. You start to believe that leaving them would mean falling apart, that independence is too frightening, that you're safer within the confines of their control than outside it. Induced dependency doesn't take away your freedom abruptly. It steals it slowly, tenderly, quietly, until the idea of standing on your own feels impossible, and the person who weakened you becomes the only one who seems capable of keeping you standing at all. Bidding for power. Bidding for power is one of the most subtly corrosive manipulation tactics because it turns every interaction, no matter how small, into a psychological contest. It's not about cooperation, connection, or understanding. It's about domination disguised as conversation. The manipulator uses tiny, calculated moves to test how much control they can gain, how much influence they can exert, and how far they can push before you push back. Each bid isn't just a moment of interaction, it's a measurement of your resistance. It usually begins with something deceptively harmless, a small request, an offhand comment, a seemingly innocent challenge to your opinion. They watch how you react. If you concede easily, they take mental notes. If you hesitate, they escalate. Every interaction becomes data, information they will later use to shape the power dynamic. Sometimes the bids are emotional, like asking you to soothe them, validate them, or reassure them beyond what feels natural. Other times, the bids are territorial, like inserting themselves into your decisions, your space, your routines, as if testing how much of your life they can influence without being questioned. The manipulator thrives on these micro exchanges because they reveal who is willing to bend. A person who concedes the little things becomes easier to mold in the bigger things. And so, the bids begin to grow. They interrupt more often. They correct you. They dismiss your opinions with subtle mockery. They challenge your boundaries with a smile. They make small demands that feel too trivial to refuse but too frequent to ignore. And the moment you give in, the dynamic shifts further toward their favor. Bidding for power works because people often avoid conflict. You let the small things go. You compromise to keep the peace. You tell yourself it's not worth making a fuss. But the manipulator relies on that instinct. They hide their hunger for control behind casual interactions, turning politeness into permission. Each time you yield, even slightly, they gain psychological ground. And once they sense your patterns, your fears, your triggers, your desire to avoid tension, they tailor their bids with precision. Over time, the cumulative effect is suffocating. You wake up one day and realize the balance has flipped. They dominate conversations. They steer decisions. They interpret your silence as consent. You find yourself going along with things that make you uncomfortable simply because it seems easier than resisting. The manipulator doesn't have to fight for control anymore. They've already won it through a series of tiny, strategic victories. What makes bidding for power so emotionally damaging is how invisible it feels while it's happening. It doesn't look like manipulation. It looks like personality. It looks like assertiveness. It looks like small, everyday exchanges that don't seem important until they all stack up. By the time you notice the pattern, your confidence has been quietly shaved down. You begin doubting your right to push back. You soften your tone, your presence, your needs, just to avoid triggering their next bid. The true cruelty of this tactic is that it convinces you that you're losing because you're weak, when in reality, the game was designed by someone who never wanted partnership, only dominance. With each tiny test, each subtle push, each calculated challenge, the manipulator isn't trying to understand you. They're trying to conquer you, one small concession at a time. Controlled chaos. Controlled chaos is one of the most psychologically disorienting manipulation tactics because it keeps you in a constant state of emotional turbulence, never fully grounded, never fully calm, and never fully certain of what will happen next. Instead of creating stability, predictability, or trust, the manipulator deliberately introduces confusion, conflict, or unpredictability into your life, just enough to keep you off balance, but never enough for you to recognize it as intentional. It is the art of manufacturing instability so you become too overwhelmed, too exhausted, or too dependent to question the person controlling the storm. It often begins subtly, with sudden changes in plans, unexpected emotional reactions, or unpredictable shifts in their behavior. One moment they are warm and affectionate, the next they are cold and distant. One day they praise you, the next they criticize you for the same thing. You never know which version of them you will get, and that uncertainty becomes the cage. Your nervous system stays on high alert, constantly scanning for signs of danger or rejection. You begin tiptoeing around them, adjusting everything you do to avoid triggering the next wave of chaos. What makes controlled chaos so powerful is the psychological effect of unpredictability. Humans crave patterns. When life is stable, the mind relaxes, analyzes, and becomes capable of clear judgment. But when everything feels unstable, the brain shifts into survival mode. Logic fades, self-protection takes over, and in that heightened state, you become more malleable, more compliant, and more easily influenced. The manipulator uses this instability to shape your behavior, making you cling to the brief moments of peace they offer, like a drowning person reaching for air. Over time, controlled chaos creates emotional dependency, because the manipulator is the one who creates the turmoil and the one who temporarily ends it. Your mind begins to associate them with both fear and relief. This duality is addictive. The calm moments feel euphoric, not because they are truly loving, but because they contrast so sharply with the emotional storms. You start chasing those rare moments of harmony, convincing yourself that if you just try harder, behave better, give more, the chaos will stop. But it never does, because the chaos is the mechanism of control. The manipulator uses this tactic to make you doubt your own stability. They create confusion, then accuse you of being dramatic. They start arguments, then blame you for overreacting. They change plans, then criticize you for being inflexible. They send mixed signals, then tell you you're imagining things. The chaos they orchestrate becomes the evidence they use to undermine your confidence, making you feel like the unstable one, even as they pull every string behind the scenes. The emotional toll of controlled chaos is profound. You begin to lose your sense of self because your thoughts, emotions, and decisions revolve entirely around navigating their unpredictability. You stop planning your own life because you're always bracing for the next eruption. You stop voicing your needs because any expression risks igniting another storm. You start shrinking, dimming, folding yourself into smaller and smaller shapes just to survive the whirlwind they create. Controlled chaos doesn't just break your peace, it breaks your equilibrium. It keeps you suspended in a state of confusion where the manipulator becomes the only steady point, even though they're the ones shaking the ground beneath you. And by the time you realize the chaos was never random, you've already been conditioned to believe that the only escape lies in pleasing the very person who created the storm. Manufactured urgency. Manufactured urgency is one of the most manipulative psychological tactics because it hijacks your sense of time, pressure, and consequence to force decisions you would never make if you felt calm and grounded. Instead of giving you space to think, the manipulator compresses the moment until it feels like you're standing on a ticking clock. They create the illusion that you must act immediately, before you're ready, before you're informed, before you can truly consider what's best for you. It is psychological suffocation disguised as opportunity, crisis, or just trying to help. This tactic often begins with an artificial deadline or sudden escalation that feels slightly off. They tell you something must be decided right now. They insist this is your last chance. They claim someone else is waiting, watching, ready to take what could be yours. They use phrases that make your pulse jump. If you don't do this now, it's gone. Or, I need an answer immediately. Or, don't overthink it. The pressure feels real because they say it with intensity, and urgency has a way of bypassing logical thought. You become focused on not losing something instead of questioning whether you even want it. Manufactured urgency works because it taps into the fear of missing out, the fear of regret, and the fear of disappointing others. It triggers your survival instincts, making your emotional brain louder than your rational one. Manipulators rely on this moment of panic, knowing that rushed decisions often favor the person applying the pressure. When you feel cornered by time, you stop analyzing motives, red flags, or long-term consequences. You act to relieve the stress, and that relief becomes the manipulator's victory. Over time, this tactic becomes a pattern. Every disagreement becomes an emergency. Every request becomes a do-or-die moment. Every opportunity becomes now or never. And you, conditioned by previous rushed decisions, start reacting instead of thinking. You lose the ability to evaluate situations at your own pace. The manipulator uses this to guide you like a puppet. Pull a string of urgency, and you jump. What makes manufactured urgency emotionally brutal is how it turns your decision-making process into a battlefield. You begin to distrust your ability to choose. You fear slowing down because you've been trained to believe hesitation equals loss. You fear asking questions because the manipulator acts offended or irritated by any delay. You fear taking your time because they make it seem reckless, irresponsible, or ungrateful. Your choices stop feeling like choices. They become reactions to pressure. And beneath the surface, something even more painful begins to happen. You lose your sense of agency. You start believing that life moves too fast for you to keep up. You start accepting rushed decisions as normal. You stop asking for time because you've been conditioned to think you don't deserve it. The manipulator doesn't need to justify the urgency anymore. You've internalized it. You rush yourself before they even speak. Manufactured urgency doesn't just steal your time, it steals your clarity. It forces you into decisions shaped by fear instead of truth, pressure instead of preference, panic instead of intuition. It's the art of making you feel like the world will collapse if you stop to breathe, when in reality, breathing is the very thing that would reveal the manipulation for what it is. The labeling technique. The labeling technique is one of the most deceptively powerful psychological tactics because it plants an identity in your mind, one you begin to carry, defend, and eventually believe. It works by assigning you a label, positive or negative, and subtly shaping your behavior around that label until you unconsciously live up to it. A single phrase, "You're so responsible," "You're difficult," "You're the strong one," "You're overreacting," can become a script you start following without even realizing you never wrote it. This tactic often begins with simple statements that feel harmless. The manipulator might call you clingy when you seek closeness, or cold when you ask for space. They might label you selfish for expressing needs, or overly emotional for reacting to hurt. Even seemingly positive labels, "You're the one who always fixes things," "You're the calm one," "You're the dependable one," can turn into invisible chains that lock you into roles you never agreed to play. Once the label is spoken, it lingers in your mind like a quiet instruction. The labeling technique works because humans instinctively respond to identity cues. When someone repeatedly tells you who you are, your brain begins to internalize it. You start evaluating your actions not by what feels right, but by whether they fit the label you've been given. If the label is negative, you might work overtime to disprove it, shaping your behavior around avoiding the accusation. If the label is positive, you might feel obligated to live up to it, even when it harms you or stretches you past your limits. Either way, the manipulator succeeds. The label becomes a leash. Over time, the label starts influencing your emotions, decisions, and self-perception. You may find yourself apologizing for things that aren't your fault because you've been told you're the difficult one. You may stop expressing your needs because they said you're too demanding. You may take on burdens you shouldn't have to carry because they insisted you're the strong one who can handle everything. You begin shrinking or stretching yourself to fit a mold created not from truth, but from manipulation. The most damaging part of the labeling technique is how it quietly overrides your own identity. Instead of asking yourself who you are, you start asking yourself who they say you are. You stop trusting your emotional reactions because they labeled them dramatic. You stop defending your boundaries because they labeled them selfish. You stop expecting respect because they labeled you overly sensitive. The manipulator doesn't just influence your behavior, they influence the story you tell yourself about your own worth. What makes this tactic especially cruel is that it often comes wrapped in false authority. The manipulator states their labels with confidence, as if they know you better than you know yourself, and because most people want to be understood, you accept those statements more easily than you should. Their certainty becomes your confusion, their judgment becomes your insecurity, their words become your inner voice. By the time you recognize the labeling technique, you may already feel trapped inside an identity that was never yours. You find yourself living in a cage built not from actions, but from words designed to shape you into whatever version of yourself serves their control.